A Russian security service officer murdered in London with radioactive poison. But who gave the orders and why? This week, we are looking at one of the most dramatic spy stories of this century, the killing in 2006 in London of Alexander Litvinenko. Now, Litvinenko is a former Russian FSB security service officer, and he is murdered in a very shocking way, a way that shocked London, shocked the world. He is poisoned with polonium. We are going to be looking at this story, which I think will be a murder mystery in many ways, looking at who Litvinenko was really, why was he killed, how was he killed, the people behind it, and it's a story that I think lets us peel back the layers on modern Russia, Vladimir Putin, friend of the show, of course, Vladimir Putin, MI6 spy operations, and some really dark corners of the underbelly of the modern Russian state.
This episode is brought to you by HP.
In intelligence work, it's rarely the obvious problem that causes failure. It's the overlooked detail or the flaw nobody quite solved. The kind of vulnerability intelligence services look for.
And running a business is the same, especially when you're building or growing a team. It's the risks you can't see or don't understand. HP designs technology so devices, collaboration tools, and security work together as a single system, helping teams keep everything running smoothly at home, in the office, and out in the field.
The protection is built in. Hardware-level security working quietly in the background, helping reduce risk without creating more work.
With a team of business advisors, HP helps businesses of all sizes find technology that fits their needs and budget.
To see how HP helps businesses work securely and productively, visit hp.com/classified. The Rest is Classified listeners also benefit from 10% off HP business technology with code TRIC10. It's also a story about the kind of people who tried to make Russia different from what it had been, and who, of course, tragically, ultimately fail in their efforts to steer Russia in a different direction. Because, at the heart of this story is, to some degree, a very personal animosity between Litvinenko, the victim, and Vladimir Putin.
And it does get to this bigger issue about how Putin operates, what kind of state Russia is, which all matter for today. This isn't just a history story in that way, but it also tells us how and why the Russian state kills its enemies abroad. And it's fair to say that a lot of people, not just Litvinenko himself, who we're going to meet in this story, end up dead in, at the very least, mysterious circumstances, and some very suspicious, I think.
It's also a story about the British state standing up, isn't it, Gordon, and just saying no to Russian influence,
okay,
no to Russian money in the city. We are not going to tolerate the murder of Russian dissidents and British citizens on British soil. Wouldn't you say, Gordon? Or do I have it wrong? Is it actually the exact opposite of what I just said?
Okay. You've made your point. They basically didn't want to know. They didn't want to know what Russians were up to. There were other interests at stake, which we'll get to. And there were a lot of people in the British state who did their best to move on from the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. And the British state's reaction, I think, is frankly, quite shocking. And a lot of the details that we're going to talk about may not have come to attention if it hadn't been for instance, the campaigning of Alexander Litvinenko's widow, Marina, to get the truth out there. It's worth saying we're going to have her as a guest, a special guest for a bonus episode for members. So do join up if you want to hear that. We'll also be hearing from some of the police officers who are directly involved in investigating this, to just understand just how significant this story was, not just for individuals, but I think for Britain, as well as in the bigger spy wars with Russia.
Well, the man himself, Alexander Litvinenko, is the heart of this story. So maybe we start with him. So who is Alexander Litvinenko, Gordon? Where does he come from?
Alexander Litvinenko, born 4th December 1962 in Voronezh in southwestern Russia, then part of the Soviet Union, of course, Cold War days. His parents Walter and Nina divorce when he's young, and his childhood, I don't think, was very easy. He's moving around different parts of the family. From age 12, he's actually living with his grandparents in a place called Nalchik, which is in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus is close to Chechnya, which is one of the republics that made up the Soviet Union and plays a role in this story. He leaves school at 17, applies to go to university, doesn't get a place, so instead goes to military college. His grandfather had fought in the Second World War, so that might have been an influence. His college is a training center for the Interior Ministry, so still in Soviet days, located in the city of North Ossetia, about 80 miles from Nalchik, where he's growing up. And he graduates in 1985 as a lieutenant. Sandy hair, quite serious. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of him when he's young. Mm-hmm. He's got a kind of both a serious and a kind of slightly innocent, boyish face, which I think maybe goes a bit to his personality, as we'll see. And then he serves in something called the Dzerzhinsky Division of the Interior Ministry between 1985 and 1988. I like this. His duty, so he's not really a spy at this point, but one of his jobs is protecting trains carrying gold bullion around the Soviet Union. So he's more at this point, more like a kind of upmarket armed guard, than a spy as such.
Well, and then in 1988, he is recruited to join what was then still called the Committee for State Security, of course, the KGB. How did the KGB find him and why?
Well, I guess he's come through the Interior Ministry, so it's the next step up if you're ambitious. August 1991, he's in Moscow. Big moment for the Soviet Union. The KGB hardliners try a coup against Gorbachev, who's then leading the Soviet Union and is reforming it. The coup fails, it peters out. The Soviet Union's going to collapse into its constituent parts, including Russia. At this point, Litvinenko is assigned to a new division, which is the Economic Security and Organized Crime Unit of what was the KGB, but it's going to become known as the FSB, the Domestic Security Service. And he's going to work in that department until 1994.
Having spoken to agency officers who served in Moscow and St. Petersburg over this time period, I mean, this was a time in Russia where people who served remember hearing a lot of gunfire in the streets regularly. There was a lot of gangland violence as the Russian state had severely weakened. At the same time, I guess you have something that is trying to be a free market that's taking off. People are trying to make money. You have businessmen who are essentially looting and taking over what had been Soviet state enterprises, and violence, because again, the Russian state, I guess scholars would debate whether it has truly collapsed, but it has gotten very, very weak. And violence, as a result, is being used to sort of settle business deals, both small and large, as that state control has collapsed. And I guess Litvinenko is in the middle of this because he is part of the sort of former KGB unit that is looking at organized crime.
And who, by chance, is a senior official in St. Petersburg at this time and a former KGB officer? First appearance, Vladimir Putin. Putin had grown up in the city, served in Germany, and then comes back to Russia. At this point, he's left what was the KGB and the FSB. He's involved in politics in the city.
He's out, right? He's fully out of the KGB.
No such thing as a former KGB officer. Litvinenko hasn't yet met Putin, but that he's investigating. And I guess what he's seeing is the way in which the security services are becoming intertwined with this new chaotic economy and with organized crime. And that's going to be his specialism, investigating those links between the different sides.
At the same time, you have this effectively a kind of merger between Russian organized crime and the former KGB, now FSB. Litvinenko is trying to uproot the organized crime that has actually embedded itself in the organization that he serves. So you can see there's going to be a lot of tension in that relationship.
Because he's idealistic. I think that's the one thing about him. He's quite idealistic. I think he believes he can make a difference. He's also, at this point, going to meet another important character in our story, Marina. Marina's born Moscow 1962. She does 5 years at university, but her real passion is ballroom dancing. By 1993, she's no longer dancing competitively, but has become a dance teacher. And it's interesting because at this point, two of Marina's friends from her dancing days, a couple, are getting demands for money. So extortion, threats of violence from a former business associate. They report this to the authorities, And Litvinenko comes in to investigate, and he takes it seriously. He offers to help them. He offers them protection. He seems really dedicated. It's that bit of his personality, which is quite idealistic, quite dedicated. And then he and Marina get together, and they will get married in October 1994. And earlier in that summer, their son Anatoly is born, June 1994. So he's taken on a new family life as well in Moscow.
And it's about at the same time in 1994 that Litvinenko is going to meet another key character in the story, a man named Boris Berezovsky, who I also think it's sort of de rigueur that any Russia intel story that takes place in the 1990s and early 2000s must include the character of Boris Berezovsky.
Exactly.
He is all over the place, and he's also somebody that you've met before. And you have visited his office, which I think we had maybe talked about when we did our Anna Chapman episodes over a year ago, but you knew the man a little bit.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I knew him that well, but I did visit him and meet him face to face in his office, and we'll come back to that because actually that's going to form part of that story and what he was talking to me about at that point. Really interesting, really important character, super smart, brooding, intense, ambitious, pugnacious, a plotter who is going to play a key role, as we'll see, in the rise of Vladimir Putin, but will then become his enemy. Berezovsky had gone into business in the late 80s as the economy is being liberalized. He starts with a car dealership. Then he moves into broadcasting, TV channels, airlines, oil industry.
None of that makes sense, by the way.
No, as a conglomerate.
You wrote it all together like it somehow makes sense as this natural rise, but
I think it's fair to say you buy what you can get hold of in these years in Russia. They're like privatizing industries which had all been state controlled. And it's just like, yeah, I'll try and buy that. I'll get hold of a bit of that. And I think that's what they're doing. These oligarchs, as they become known, are making huge fortunes by being aggressive in how they buy some of these companies which had been state owned. And he's going to become first among equal of the oligarchs, Berezovsky, which also means that he's going to move into politics because that's what happens is business and politics are merging because that's where power lies. It's the nature of oligarchy. That means he's going to have enemies and enemies will want to kill him. So the first time he really sees that, there's going to be a lot of plotting on people's lives. But Berezovsky's first plot, there may be more, comes on the evening of June 7th, 1994, when he's getting into his Mercedes car to drive away from his office and a remote control bomb placed under the car explodes. His driver is killed, reportedly decapitated. Sorry for the grisly detail, but Berezovsky himself is injured but survives. And it's front page news in Russia. It's a big deal, big businessman. The arrival of car bombs as a way of settling business disputes. But the crucial thing is that a sandy-haired, serious-minded 31-year-old FSB officer is assigned to investigate the assassination attempt. And that's Alexander Litvinenko.
And Litvinenko is ordered also to spy on Berezovsky, isn't he? So this gives you a sense of maybe some of the tensions in the organization, which is trying to navigate this chaotic, really violent world of, sort of post-Soviet Russia, while also ostensibly trying to bring perpetrators of these kinds of crimes to justice. But Litvinenko, it's sort of a fascinating element of the man that he's given this job, which is both go solve the crime, but also spy for us on the victim, who is a really important businessman. And I guess it makes sense. If you're the FSB, you want to know what's Berezovsky up to. And, you probably want leverage over this guy.
What's interesting is that Litvinenko will end up becoming closer to Berezovsky and in many ways more loyal to Berezovsky than he is to the FSB, the security services employers. There's a story where a TV presenter on the channel Berezovsky owns is murdered. Police come to talk to Berezovsky about it. Berezovsky gets a message to Litvinenko that they're coming, and Litvinenko arrives and draws his gun and stops the police taking Berezovsky away, because the fear is that this was somehow, the whole thing was a pretext to get hold of Berezovsky and maybe get rid of him and bump him off using the police, which gives you an idea of how much plotting and uncertainty there was in Russia at the time. But Berezovsky, as a result, starts to feel indebted to this security service officer.
Was Litvinenko being paid by Berezovsky at this point in time?
No, I think there might be an element of friendship or loyalty, but the signs are he really does just attach himself. And the two men, very different power relations, start to become, I mean, friends is perhaps the wrong word. Allies, maybe that's a better way of putting it, because they both have uses for each other. Berezovsky's powerful, Litvinenko's in the FSB. And Berezovsky's power is going to grow because at one point it looks like Yeltsin's going to lose, Yeltsin being the president of Russia at this time, might lose the 1996 election to a communist. So Yeltsin needs money. So he does a secret deal with the oligarchs where they're going to throw their money and influence behind his campaign. And in return, they're going to get a bigger stake in some of the industries, so even more economic power. Berezovsky brokers this deal. And as a result, he's going to end up becoming deputy head of the National Security Council in the wake of the election. So you can see Berezovsky is moving closer and closer to power, and Litvinenko is to some extent with him in that journey.
But then there is this very interesting interlude for Litvinenko, because, and I think it really does cast a long shadow over this story for him personally, which is that he ends up going to Chechnya, where in 94, this absolutely brutal conflict breaks out. Now, Chechnya, of course, had been one of the Soviet republics. It's largely Muslim. It had been seeking independence. And Litvinenko is sent there to work on counterterrorism.
It's close to Nalchik, where he grew up, so he knows the terrain. And so he's going to get asked to do interrogation, interviews of people. He's also, at some point, certainly going to be involved in combat operations. He's present at one siege, and he's going to see the violence that Russian forces use to subdue Chechen desires and fights for independence. I mean, the Russians are going to flatten Chechen cities. The experience there starts to change Litvinenko. There's one example where he's involved in interrogating a 17-year-old Chechen prisoner, and he realizes all the pupils in that boy's class had taken up arms. And he begins to compare the Chechen defense of their country with the actions of Russians in the Second World War defending their country against an invader. So it's starting to change his mindset to maybe these people are fighting for freedom. So he's idealistic, almost naive, and more open to different ideas about the Russian state. But soon he's going to be back in Moscow, and there he's going to directly confront Vladimir Putin in a dramatic encounter which will define his life and death. By the summer of 1997, Litvinenko's in a new team in the Lubyanka, the famous headquarters of the Russian security services, KGB in the old days, now the FSB. And it's a team for the investigation and prevention of organized crime, known as URPO, URPO. But, David, are they preventing organized crime, or are they part of it? That is the question.
The answer is yes, right? They're both preventing it, and then more broadly, the FSB is also part of it. And Litvinenko, I find this fascinating about him, Gordon, is that he's distressed by this. He seems surprised that the FSB is embroiled not just in maybe mundane corruption, but much more serious things like kidnapping and assault. It's, the organization in this period, or elements of the organization, are carrying out violent vendettas for both politicians and criminals. It's involved in some cases, most likely in murder. And so Litvinenko, this kind of idealistic, somewhat naive guy who's supposed to be stopping all of this as part of his work with URPO, is actually seeing it take place on his watch, and it's being conducted by his colleagues.
And he's outraged by it. And then the next thing that happens, now he's in this unit, he's asked to look into assassinating no less than Boris Berezovsky, the guy he got close to. I mean, which is wild that there is a discussion about this. Although in true intelligence service style, the request is given verbally. It's not like a piece of paper going, please assassinate, the deputy head of the National Security Council. But that gives you a sense of what people in this organization were doing. They were fulfilling vendettas and dealing with political agendas and using murder and criminals to do it. It's pretty crazy stuff. And Berezovsky certainly has a lot of enemies. He's just negotiated a peace deal with the Chechen rebels. Hardliners see that as a sellout. He's obviously a powerful figure. But Litvinenko, this is the guy he'd got to know, protecting a few years earlier. So he's shocked. And there's an element in which they do see themselves as allies against the corrupt hardliners of the FSB. So Litvinenko is motivated by this idealism. And Berezovsky is also actually at this point thinking, I want to clear out some of these old KGB hardliners and trying to do it. So you can see that they've got an alignment, and this is going to draw them even closer together because Litvinenko and others in the FSB want to be whistleblowers about the corruption. They're nervous. They make a video of their allegations. It's filmed by one of Berezovsky's TV presenters at Berezovsky's dacha. You're looking pained at the idea of of doing that. I mean, it's a risky move.
It seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're going to see him do in this period, in retrospect, looks mad.
Yeah, it does.
But at the time, I think there was still this view that Russia was on a path to perhaps cleaning up some of this problem, and that was possible. Now, in hindsight, we know it didn't happen. But at that time, I guess they think it is possible. So Litvinenko and Berezovsky go to the head of the FSB, a man called Kovalyev, and the FSB, of course, bosses and others are really unhappy that Litvinenko has told Berezovsky about the plot. It's like, what are you doing? And why are you making these allegations about corruption? That's kind of what we do. And they're saying, you've got to withdraw this. So he's now coming into tension and into these clashes with his bosses. He'll talk about getting beaten up in the street, harassed, bugged.
Litvinenko's beaten up in the street?
Well, yeah. Yeah, so he's beaten up by some youths on the street. And he takes it as possibly having been arranged by his enemies in the FSB. But I think, can't be sure about that. And he thinks he's bugged. He gets harassed at work. All this stuff's happening. So it's getting spicy. But President Yeltsin removes the head of the FSB, Kovalyev. So this looks like Berezovsky's clear-out drive is winning, and he might be able to increase his power.
He's going to put a reformer in at the FSB, right, Gordon?
Yeah,
someone
what you do.
From the outside who's really going to clean up
someone
shop.
You can trust, David. That's what you want. Someone you can trust. So Berezovsky himself engineers, it looks like, or has a role in putting this young guy who, well, youngish, looks like he might be the future, Vladimir Putin.
Oh. And he is the future. He is the future.
He is the future. Not in the way people think. Not in the way people think. So he's the new FSB head. At the time, it was seen as pretty weird because Putin hadn't been a big senior KGB officer. He'd not been very senior. He'd been in St. Petersburg in the mayor's office. And suddenly he's the head of the FSB. He's kind of jumping over lots of other people who should have got that job.
He's seen, I think, by Berezovsky as a kind of blank slate that Berezovsky can write his own message on, and Berezovsky can control him, is the thought, right? We'll see how that turns out, with no spoilers here, but let's see if Berezovsky can keep Vladimir Putin under control.
So Berezovsky arranges for Litvinenko to go and see Putin, the new FSB head, July 1998. And this is this pivotal moment for both men, actually, because they're going to have this confrontation. It doesn't last long, maybe 10 minutes, but it is incredibly important for what happens next, particularly for Litvinenko in his life. Putin, of course, not a tall man, takes up martial arts at school so he can stand up for himself and likes to intimidate. But on this occasion, he's cagey. But we do have an account, don't we, from Litvinenko himself. And it's interesting. Should we read it? Do you want to read it?
I'll read it, Gordon. Let me read it. So this is Litvinenko's account of the meeting with Putin. He came out from behind the desk to greet me. Apparently, he wanted to show an open, likable personality. Has Putin ever... Was there a point in his... This is me now. Was there ever a point in Putin's life where he was attempting to show an open, likable personality? Anyhow, back to the Litvinenko account. We operatives have a special style of behavior. We do not bow to each other, we do without pleasantries, and so everything is clear. Just look into each other's eyes and it becomes clear. Do you trust the person or not? And I immediately had the impression that he is not sincere. He looked not like an FSB director, but a person who played the director.
So this meeting is so interesting because Litvinenko is there to outline his knowledge of corruption in the FSB and the links to organized crime. And he's brought along this dossier that he's drawn up on everything he knows.
Dossiers are bad ideas. We established this in our Iraq WMD series. Never bring a dossier anywhere.
No, and I'm afraid in this case, this dossier is also going to be destined for the rubbish heap of history because it's everything that Litvinenko has collected about links to drug smuggling and organized crime from the FSB. And he offers to hand it over to Putin. And Putin goes, nah.
Does Litvinenko not know at this point that Putin has been involved in these activities in St. Petersburg?
Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't.
He missed it in the dossier.
He missed it in the dossier.
Missed it.
But I guess what he's thinking is Putin is perhaps Berezovsky's guy like me. Perhaps Putin is there thanks to Berezovsky to some extent.
Yeah.
I think Berezovsky always exaggerates how much, influence he has over these decisions. But he's perhaps hoping this is the new guy. The last guy, after all, got sacked by the president. So maybe this is the guy. But when he tries to hand over the dossier, Putin goes, "You keep it. It's your work." I mean, that's a bad start. And then he's also got this list of all the FSB officers who Litvinenko thinks are clean. And he tells Putin, well, there are some honest people in the system. And together, we could battle corruption and the mafia despite the dangers. And I like the description. Putin nods.
Yes.
Putin writes down Litvinenko's home phone number and he says, "Sure, I'll call you." I mean, it's tragic. I find it sad.
It is sad.
It is sad. This is a guy who thinks everyone else is breaking the rules, but we can change the system. And of course, as soon as Litvinenko leaves the room, Putin orders an investigation into Litvinenko and for the investigation into the corruption allegations to get dropped. So immediately Putin is showing his hand, I think, isn't he?
I do think it is a very sad, a very tragic undercurrent to the story that there are so many people in Russia at this time who are trying, even inside the system like Litvinenko, who think that there's a different and better way to run the state. And they are ultimately, of course, not successful because they're up against this massive organization, the KGB, which by the end of the Soviet era was the most powerful organization in the Soviet Union. And it hasn't been dismantled at this point.
Yeah.
It's very much alive and well. So then, Litvinenko, and I find this is wild, Gordon, because on November 17th of 1998, he then decides to do something which in retrospect seems totally insane because he goes public with his criticism of the FSB.
Yeah. He and some of his colleagues are going to organize a press conference saying they are FSB officers. And it's really interesting because the other FSB officers wear ski masks, kind of balaclavas to hide their faces. But Litvinenko is the one guy who doesn't do that.
Why?
I just think he's got this idealistic, as you said, maybe naive, that's maybe also the word, view that the truth is going to win out. I'm going to be open about this. I'm going to fight it. And he's going to just say that we've received illegal orders to kill, to kidnap, to extort. Instead of protecting the state, senior FSB officials are part of the problem. And this press conference is obviously massive at the time. And you can see pictures of it. Berezovsky is in the background, of course, and he's hoping he can use this perhaps to get Putin to purge the old guard and the enemies. And he doesn't realize, I think, that Putin is allied to that old guard of KGB, as you said, FSB officers who are tied into corruption, that he's already chosen his side. He's not capable of being pushed to a different direction. So these hopes are going to be dashed. And it marks Litvinenko out as a man who'd, in Putin's eyes, in colleagues' eyes, as a traitor. And Putin is going to actually single out Litvinenko in a personal way in some comments soon after, talking about his marriage and other things. And it's that sense where Putin really takes things personally. He's a kind of guy who has grudges, and particularly people he views as traitors. Litvinenko is arrested March 1999. He spends 8 months in prison, the famous Lefortovo prison in Moscow, where spies and political prisoners are held.
A lot of deep history at that prison. It's a pretty grisly place. They shot a lot of people there during the terror, and they have these, in many of the cells, there are these kind of scupper drains that are built into the walls because they were shooting so many people that they had to have cleanup.
Drain the blood.
Right. And so there's drains on the side of the walls, and then they've got pressure hoses, or had pressure hoses in most of the rooms, so they can shoot someone, spray the thing down, and bring someone else in to kill them.
It's grim, isn't it?
This is the rich history of the prison where they hold Litvinenko.
And luckily, he does make it out. He gets acquitted in his first trial in November 1999. As he is acquitted, FSB officers come into the courtroom and arrest him again. I mean, it's just like you couldn't get a clearer signal. We are going to get you. And then he's released on bail in December 1999. This is such an interesting moment because so much else is going on in Russia. Big changes in Russian politics. President Yeltsin was ill. His priority is getting out of office in a way that protects him and his family from corruption charges. They think we need an empty vessel who will do that, who will give us immunity, come up with a deal. Who do they pick? Vladimir Putin.
Volodya. Yes, indeed. Everyone thought this guy was malleable.
Our guy.
Yeah, our guy.
And he's a spy. He's going to bring strength and stability. So he gets, first of all, made prime minister August 1999. And then something important happens, which we will come back to, because there's a series of devastating bomb blasts which hit apartment buildings in Russia in September. So just after Putin is made prime minister, hundreds of people are killed. These appear to be dramatic terrorist attacks which scare the country. It's blamed on Chechens. They confirm the idea you need a strong man, a former KGB man, some might say, to take on the Chechen insurgents. And this paves the way for Putin's rise. Yeltsin then resigns New Year's Eve 1999. Putin, from almost nowhere, is acting president, does the deal with the Yeltsin family. He's going to become president. Very quickly, though, it becomes obvious, doesn't it, that he's not the empty vessel, because summer 2000, Putin summons all these oligarchs, the big businessmen, to a barbecue. I mean, I love the image of the barbecue. Sausages. I don't think Putin would be grilling the sausages himself.
Putin had the chef's hat on and the apron, and he's turning the sausages over. Yeah,
I don't think that's how it works. And he says to the oligarchs, "You're not running me, I'm running you. You are my guys. You bend the knee, or else you're out. Stay out of politics. Then you can keep your money. If you interfere in politics, I'll take you down." And Berezovsky is the guy who is not happy with that. He's one of a few who are not happy with that. But he's one of the first ones to really clash with Putin. And there's this really interesting thing where there's a moment where this really comes to life. A Russian submarine, the Kursk, sinks in the Barents Sea, August 2000. 118 people are on board. It's a really dramatic story as families are hoping maybe these men could be rescued. And Berezovsky's TV stations go hard on the new president, Putin.
26 years later, Gordon, this is now an impossible situation to imagine that you actually have Russian media that are taking the president to task, because Putin's on vacation when this happens, right? And the response is seen as slow and kind of tepid, and Berezovsky just has his stations rake him over the coals for this. Putin is not amused by this treatment, though.
No, it's fair to say. So Putin summons Berezovsky to the Kremlin and basically says, hand over your TV channel. Give it to me, because you can't go on like this. It's the new Putin way, which is I'm going to put order in. Oligarchs aren't going to tell me what to do. Berezovsky refuses. And so he flees to the United Kingdom, late 2000, via France, I think, claims asylum. And from there, he begins to plot. But the crucial thing is, he's not the only one to flee.
So during the year 2000, Litvinenko, he's out on bail and very unsurprisingly concerned for his family. He's getting harassed, fair to say, getting messages from people inside the FSB that he's viewed as a traitor. And Marina has said that her husband had actually been approached by an FSB colonel who had said, "We will not continue discussions with you. We will kill you. To be clear, we will kill you and your 6-year-old son. You are being prosecuted not for any crimes that you may have committed. Everybody knows that you did not commit them. You are being prosecuted for betraying the system and openly acting against the system."
Yeah, that's right. So late September, Litvinenko tells Marina he's flying to Nalchik to visit relatives, but he then crosses into nearby Georgia. He can get in there. His international passport has been taken by the FSB, but he's got an internal one which he can use to cross the border, goes to the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi. He passes a message to Berezovsky, who in turn contacts some of his people, so particularly a guy called Yuri Felchinsky, a Russian-American writer, investigator of the FSB. Felchinsky travels from Boston to Tbilisi to meet Litvinenko. All of this and all that we hear about, it's going to be funded by Berezovsky. Litvinenko gets a message to Marina, his wife, tells her to buy a new mobile phone, calls her on the new phone, tells her her and Anatoly, their son, has to go on holiday anywhere, just get somewhere. He speaks to her when she's in Spain, and he says he's not in Nalchik, he's in Georgia. They have to decide if they're ever going to return to Russia. If they go back, the chances are He's going to get arrested, jailed, killed, maybe even their son. They can't be safe. Marina, I think at that point, agrees it's time to go. They first try the US Embassy in Tbilisi, looking for political asylum. It's refused.
I think it makes some sense, yeah.
And then Litvinenko gets a false Georgian passport. Not entirely clear how. They then use that to go to Turkey, to Antalya. Felchinsky goes and gets Berezovsky's private plane. He's got a private jet. It's helpful when you're trying to escape places. To collect Marina and bring her and Anatoly to Antalya, so the family are reunited. Felchinsky at this point is replaced by another Russian exile, a guy called Alex Goldfarb, scientist, activist from New York. Alex asks people before he leaves in Washington, he says, how do I get this guy out? Can I take him to an embassy? They say, don't get involved. Too dangerous. So now it's Goldfarb, Litvinenko. They go to Ankara in Turkey, try the US embassy there. He gets interviewed by the Americans for 3 hours. He goes back to the hotel that evening, I think realizing he's not going to get out and he's going to be told the next day no. I think you're right. I think it looks a bit complicated, looks a bit murky. The politics with Russia are, do you want to get into a fight with someone who's the new Russian leader's enemy? So they escape. They drive out in the middle of the night from the car park. They fear the FSB are on their tail. At this point, they're getting pretty desperate, I think. One of Berezovsky's business partners suggests sending a boat to pick them up in Istanbul. But Alex Goldfarb is with Litvinenko, is researching where they could get by air without a visa. And the solution they eventually hit upon was to fly to the UK, to London, by purchasing tickets from Istanbul to Tbilisi via London, as that didn't require a transit visas. That's not a logical route, but that's the one they picked precisely because of the visa regime. So 1st November 2000, Alexander, Litvinenko, Marina and Anatoly fly to London. They land at Heathrow. Litvinenko approaches the first police officer he can see in the transit area, and he says, I am KGB officer, and I'm asking for political asylum. The UK say he can stay while his asylum application is considered, and he takes the name Edwin Carter. Don't know where he gets that from, but to keep a low profile while he waits. So he's obviously worried the FSB might be on his tail. He's going to get asylum in May 2001. There's a story he tells about this, which I think is quite powerful. He says, when after we were given asylum here, I took my son, Anatoly, to the Tower of London, and I showed him the British crown, and I told him, Sonny, you must defend this country in future until the last drop of your blood. And he said, yes, Dad. I told him, remember, for the rest of your life, this country saved us, and do everything, whatever you might be able to do in order to defend this country. So it's very interesting. He's immediately feeling quite allied and grateful for this. As we said, Berezovsky, this plotting oligarchical figure, has also fled to the UK, and Berezovsky is going to financially support Litvinenko and his family. They're going to move to a house in Muswell Hill in North London, 2002, where they're going to live for the rest of his life. The family take English lessons, but Alexander struggles, I think, a bit more with learning the language than his wife, Marina. Marina gets a job as a dance teacher in Finchley. Could, of course, been a quiet life, but it's not going to be because he's got this obsessive nature. He's got this desire to confront what he sees as the corruption inside Russia and inside the security service. And he's moving in a circle of Russian exiles and dissidents. One of them is a guy called Vladimir Putin, who was released from Soviet prison in 1976. And he talks to Litvinenko about the dark history of the KGB. And Marina will say these conversations help change Alexander Litvinenko, make him a dissident. Another friend who lives nearby and is also under Berezovsky's wing is Ahmed Zakayev, who's a Chechen leader in exile, who's a political Chechen leader, but the FSB will say is an extremist, a terrorist, all these things. So he's moving very much still in these circles.
Berezovsky himself is becoming a very active supporter of anti-Putin people and organizations, and Litvinenko is sort of all swirled up in this. And Litvinenko does seem obsessive, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Obviously, Litvinenko had seen during the 1990s while working for the FSB a lot of really terrible stuff that the organization was doing. So why is it that these conversations in London are so formative in shaping his anti-Putin and anti-FSB worldview? Because it seems like the reason he's in London in the first place is because he had become a dissident from within the system.
I guess he'd seen the recent history and the recent corruption. But what Bukowski and others will say is this is deeper. and there are deeper roots into the KGB and into the Soviet Russian past, which explains some of this. So I think it will change him. And Litvinenko is obsessed with telling people about the truth about what the FSB is up to. Berezovsky's backing him, and he's quite useful to Berezovsky. He acts partly as a security advisor. He's an ex-security service officer, but he's also going to carve out a new career backed by Berezovsky as a writer and investigator. And here I think we get to a really important moment in the story, because in 2001, Litvinenko is going to co-author a book with Yuri Felchinsky, who we heard about last time, helped him get out of Russia, also allied to Berezovsky, who investigates the FSB. And the book is going to be called Blowing Up Russia. And this, David, makes a massive allegation against Putin and the FSB, doesn't it?
Does. And the book claims that elements in the FSB had been behind the bombing of those apartment buildings in Russia in 1999. The bombings, I think, had been influential in tilting many Russians into seeing someone like Putin as a necessary kind of, you needed a strong former security service leader to run Russia, because you had these Chechen terrorists conducting these bombings. And Litvinenko says, no, these bombings were actually conducted by elements of the FSB to provide a pretext for a second intervention in Chechnya. And at this point right now in this pod, we're not going to go super deep into this theory, but there is one particular event that I think does bear some mentioning here, because it's critical to Litvinenko's argument.
Yeah, because after the bombing campaign starts, locals spot 3 people in Ryazan, a city in southern Russia, unloading sacks from the back of a car with Moscow license plates. They put the sacks in the basement of an apartment block. This looks suspicious. Police are called. And the police initially say the sacks contain the explosives that were used in some of the other attacks. But those who planted those sacks turn out to be agents of the FSB. Now, the FSB will say the sacks actually contain sugar and it's all part of a training exercise. But this is just one piece of evidence which people use to support the idea that perhaps this was a false flag operation run by the Russian state to blame Chechens, create a fear of terrorism, create a sense you need a strong man, justify a new war, Putin's your guy.
The idea that Litvinenko is proposing is that Vladimir Putin killed 200 or so Russian citizens to create a pretext for a conflict that would cement his hold on power.
It's a wild allegation in some ways, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a big, if true, story.
Yeah. And so the book, which Litvinenko is going to author or co-author about this, comes out in Russia first, then in the UK. Berezovsky in London helps bankroll and publicize the book. And actually, this is when I meet Berezovsky. 2002, I go to his offices in Mayfair, August of that year, and sit down, very memorable for me, sit down in a big conference room. There's Berezovsky and an interpreter, because Berezovsky's English wasn't great. And he starts talking to me about the corruption of the Putin regime, and he starts talking to me about the apartment bombings. I'm there, kind of radio reporter with my mic in front of him going, this is crazy. This is wild stuff. I mean, it was a real insight. And I came out of it at the time going, I don't know what to make of this. You've got to remember, now we know what Putin's like, but at the time,
it seemed crazy, right? It seemed like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, he's sitting around the table with other leaders. It just didn't compute. But that's the time I met Berezovsky. And Litvinenko continues to work on the theory, continues to collect evidence. He's working on another book called The Gang from the Lubyanka, which is about his favorite subject, the FSB and organized crime. He's obsessively documenting this stuff. It is worth saying, isn't it, that a lot of people who investigate the apartment bombings end up dead. I think Parliament deputies who pushes a film about it, another member of a newspaper team who publicizes a book about it, other MPs. There are lots of people who investigate this who do end up dead, which some people will also use as evidence to point to possible FSB involvement. Obviously, it doesn't prove it, but it is interesting. And Litvinenko is one of them. Already, we've got one possible motive for Litvinenko's murder there, which he's pushing very aggressively.
Well, and I guess there's the fact that, the FSB already views Litvinenko as a traitor, right? I mean, even before he started to make these claims, it wouldn't have been so implausible that he would have been on the FSB's hit list, because he's seen from the FSB's lens, he's a defector.
He may not have been a spy defector in that way, but he's gone. He's left the country. He's confronted them about corruption, then fled. So he is getting harassed in London. Russian diplomats from the embassy turn up at the Litvinenko family home, and he's getting calls from people. A former colleague emails from Moscow and says another FSB officer had said the book had led to him being sentenced to extrajudicial elimination. So already, this is 2002 to 2003, though. So we're still a bit away from his murder, but you've already got one motive, I guess, if we're trying to put that together.
Litvinenko also, I mean, just very practically, he needs to find work, doesn't he? I mean, his English is not great. He's initially bankrolled by Berezovsky, but seems like those payments are reduced, and Litvinenko is increasingly needing to earn money for himself. So he moves into doing something that sounds like what a private equity firm does, due diligence, but it's a little bit shadier, I would say.
So this provides another possible motive for his murder: his work in what's called due diligence. As you said, a murky world. And these are the years when London gets known as Londongrad, late 90s, early 2000s, because Russian money is flooding into Britain. You've got a wealthy Russian community embedded in London life, oligarchs, businessmen. So you get hundreds of billions of pounds of what is often criminal money laundered through London and the city. Light touch regulation.
More like no touch, right? It feels like no touch. Looking back, the amount of money that comes through the UK is astounding. Some estimates put the number at around 100 billion pounds over the past 20 years. So now, post Ukraine, it's kind of hard to imagine it was ever like this.
Yeah.
But I mean, this was a time period where exiles like Berezovsky are in London. You also have Putin's people there. In 2003. Roman Abramovich buys the Chelsea Football Club, and Abramovich had been a Berezovsky protege.
Yeah.
But of course ends up being closely allied to Putin. So you have this, you have a real Russian stew, a borscht of Russians in London in those years. Litvinenko is just one of them.
And that's exactly right about Abramovich and Berezovsky, because you've got both a guy plotting to get rid of Putin and one of Putin's wealthy allies, all mixing in London. British intelligence, MI5.
Closely following the matter, right? Very closely watching these Russians.
Well, I love the fact that, one MI6 officer finds out in the 90s that they've stopped even monitoring the phone line of the head of Russian intelligence at the embassy in London. And he's like, what are we doing? Which is crazy. And of course, this is now, we're into after 9/11, after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, when terrorism is the priority. So within MI5, the amount of resource they're devoting to following Russian spies is going down, 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 down. And the amount of resource they're spending on chasing terrorists is going up. So that's one of the problems. It's giving the Russians also freedom to maneuver in the city. And Litvinenko knows this. But the key thing is you've got all this Russian money coming into London. You've got people wanting to make money in Russia. And that's when you need this due diligence work, because what it's effectively doing is saying, if you're a British company, you're going into partnership, or you're opening up a factory with someone in Russia, or you're having a Russian business partner coming here. Who are they? Are they who they say they are? Are they legitimate? Are they, and this is the big question people want to know, is their money dirty? Are they involved in organized crime? And that you can see absolutely why Litvinenko is really valuable, isn't he? He's a former security service officer who
is involved. He'd been involved in investigating corruption. Yeah, that was his job.
That was his job. So in some ways, he's really well placed. And he works for three firms mainly: Risk Management Limited, Titon International Limited, and Erenis UK Limited. It's interesting. We won't go in.
Are they all based in Mayfair, Gordon?
They are all based in Mayfair. How did you know?
Just a wild guess.
Anyone who's been around Mayfair, particularly in those years, will have not been surprised by the Russian accents and the Russian money that was very, very evident. So Risk is one of them. Risk is really interesting because it grew out of an earlier business set up by a guy called Stephen Curtis, and he'd been a lawyer who worked for oligarchs, including Berezovsky. He dies in a suspicious helicopter crash in the UK in 2004. And it's fair to say that as we go on through this series, odd, unusual deaths are going to be a feature, not just for Litvinenko himself.
He is doing some work as well in this period that's more spy adjacent, espionage adjacent, isn't he?
So yeah, he's looking at transcribing tapes of conversations from a president of Ukraine looking for dirt. He's involved in the Chechen cause thanks to his friendship with Ahmed Zakayev. And, David, you'll be pleased to know, here's where Vasily Mitrokhin comes into the story as well. So my favourite KGB archivist. Mitrokhin had fled to Britain with KGB secrets. 1999, some of the archive gets published, and it stirs up interest in countries about what details about KGB operations interfering in politics, paying politicians, are in the files. And in 2002, the Italian parliament establishes a commission to investigate the claims that come out of the Mitrokhin archive. And an interesting character who I've met called Mario Scaramella, does sound like something from a Bond film. Who's the guy in The Man from the Golden Gun? Was Scaramanga. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Okay. But Scaramella becomes a consultant to this commission. And he is introduced to Litvinenko, 2003, who agrees to help him with these investigations. They meet 3 or 4 times in Italy and London. Litvinenko's passing on information, including about organized crime, the entanglement of the FSB with arms dealing and other things. So that, and we'll come back to that because Scaramella is actually an interesting character in this story.
Now, of course, Gordon, when Litvinenko had arrived in the UK, he had clearly been interviewed by MI5 and MI6 before being, I guess, granted asylum, or while being granted asylum. And one thing that he had warned them was that he could see that the Russian organized crime world that he had been examining and tracking it as an FSB officer throughout the 1990s was now exporting its work into London. Of course, that's going to be of significant interest, or should be of significant interest to Britain's spy agencies.
He's also starting to engage more with MI6 particularly, partly because the money from Berezovsky is being reduced over time and he's looking for other income. And he starts working for MI6 as a consultant. Now, it's crucial here, we're quite specific about what he was doing and what he wasn't doing, but there is also a separate question which we'll get to, which is what the Russians thought or knew about what he was doing. But one thing to be clear about is he wasn't a spy for MI6 when he was in Russia, when he was in the FSB. He was not an agent being run by them in that sense. And the UK government obviously always, neither confirm nor deny, but we're sure about that. But when he comes over to the UK, he does start doing some work for them as a consultant. Marina always says he was never an agent.
You can immediately see how the Russians might perceive. I mean,
yeah,
what
might
is
not be happy about that.
Seen from Moscow, what is the difference between him being an agent and him being a consultant?
Consultant, yeah. And he's on the payroll. He gets a steady £2,000 a month. It's not insignificant from 2004 directly into his bank account from MI6. And the Brits put him in touch with European security services, particularly the Spanish. So the Russian mafia had put down deep roots in Spain, all these Russian businessmen buying property on the Spanish coast. And so Litvinenko starts to travel out there from late 2004. A Spanish judge is investigating these criminals, and Litvinenko is helping him. And the Spanish judge will say that Litvinenko's thesis that the intelligence agencies controlled organized crime in Russia had proved accurate. So his argument, Litvinenko's argument to the Spanish, is that the FSB at this point is absorbing the mafia. It's taking control over it, eliminating non-compliant mafia bosses. And Litvinenko, is providing information to the Spanish to go after some of those mafia bosses who have taken residency in Spain.
He's also going to do something much more sensitive, isn't he? Because he's going to start potentially pitching people to actually work with MI6. So again, seen from Moscow, this looks a lot like a guy who's defected and who is helping a hostile security service target Russians.
This is, I think, one of the deeper layers of Litvinenko's work, which has still not entirely been unearthed in all the inquiries, but which I spent a bit of time investigating. And it's to explain them. A lot of these different strands of the work he's doing, the due diligence, the politics, but also this spy world and the consultancy world and even the pitching world, they're actually all going to collide with his relationship with one other person who he thinks of as a friend, but who, it's alleged, will kill him. And that person's name is Andrei Lugovoi. So let's spend maybe a few moments on this other character, Andrei Lugovoi, and how he meets Litvinenko. Because Andrei Lugovoi is born in Baku in the Soviet Union, 1966, 4 years younger than Litvinenko. Family involved in the military. His grandfather fought in the Second World War. His brother serves on nuclear subs. He goes to military college, and then he joins the KGB's 9th Directorate, which provides security for senior officials. And it's going to become the Federal Protection Service. So it's kind of high-end bodyguards. But in 1996, he leaves that to go work for Boris Berezovsky. So he goes to work as head of security for Berezovsky's TV station. And then in 2001, after Berezovsky flees, Lugovoi is arrested for trying to help one of Berezovsky's allies, a guy called Nikolai Glushkov, also flee Russia. And just as a very brief footnote worth saying, Glushkov will be found dead in the UK in his home in South London, 2018. Another one of those people.
I mean, from here on out in the story, Gordon, you could almost assume that anybody who is mentioned will wind up dead because the whole cast of characters basically goes.
Yeah, I mean, Glushkov is found strangled, but it's made to look like suicide in his home in South London, 2018. But Glushkov, Berezovsky ally, Lugovoi arrested for trying to help Glushkov escape Russia. Now, this is where it gets murky, if it's not murky enough. Lugovoi was said to have spent 15 months in prison. Now, it's possible that when he was in there, he might have been approached by the FSB to work for them and infiltrate Berezovsky's circle, which would make perfect sense, wouldn't it? But others even wonder if he had never even ended up in prison, that he'd never actually spent a day there, but that was all a ruse to kind of get him to look like he was loyal to Berezovsky, because other prisoners, including Glushkov, say they never saw him in prison. But something is happening here, because after he's released from prison in 2002, he sets up his own private security company in Moscow, which is quite successful.
Which seems odd for someone who had gone to prison for helping essentially a Putin enemy, right?
Yeah.
So that's odd.
Yeah, I think it's odd. The fact he can travel, he can go to London, but he's still running a successful business in Moscow, and he's in contact with Berezovsky. All of that feels I don't know, what do you think? But it feels to me like he's already being run by the FSB at that point.
Yeah.
But Litvinenko and Lugovoi had known each other in Berezovsky's circle in the mid-1990s. They'd both been around Berezovsky. They'd lost contact, but then again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Lugovoi gets back in touch with Litvinenko October 2004. Lugovoi says, I'm over to see a football match, one of the Russian teams playing Chelsea. They have dinner, Litvinenko and Lugovoi, at a Chinese restaurant in Soho. And Lugovoi says, Alexander, if you'd like to work with me, we can earn some good money together.
And I guess Litvinenko, I mean, I guess this would, on one face of it, seem to be a failure of his due diligence capabilities, because it does seem like Lugovoi's prison story and the fact that he's now successful would be odd to Litvinenko. But on the other hand, Litvinenko knew him, right? I mean, Lugovoi had been in Berezovsky's circle, so he's got a personal connection with him that maybe, doesn't set off his antenna when he's thinking about Lugovoi's recontact. It makes sense. It's plausible.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And you can also see why it's kind of useful for Litvinenko, because he's doing this due diligence work.
He needs money.
Litvinenko can't go back he needs money, and he can't go back to Russia to talk to people, but Lugovoi is going back and forth between Russia and London. And he's a former FSB officer. So the idea of kind of doing some business together seems pretty good. So it looks like Litvinenko did trust Lugovoi. And I think that will be proved obviously a mistake. And he's going to introduce Lugovoi to Marina at Berezovsky's big birthday party at Blenheim Palace. So Lugovoi is coming to the offices, coming to some of the meetings in Mayfair, this swanky bit of London, with Litvinenko to meet some of these companies. Lugovoi is even going to Litvinenko's home whilst Marina and Anatoly are away on holiday. And it does seem like Litvinenko seems to have viewed him as a good friend. And then Lugovoi is also going to introduce Litvinenko to a second person, a guy called Dmitry Kovtun. And I'm afraid this is the second of the two people accused, although they of course deny it, of killing Litvinenko. I think Lugovoi comes across as, when you see him being interviewed, as a kind of Russian FSB hard man, whereas Kovtun, I think, is a little bit less professional in his background than Lugovoi. I mean, perhaps even somewhat clownish, but I think that's maybe overplaying it slightly because it's, he is said to be a killer.
Well, and who is Kovtun? Where does he come from?
Born in Moscow, Kovtun and Lugovoi had been old friends as children because their fathers had served together in the army. Kovtun joins the army, gets posted to East Germany, marries his first wife there, and then, only a few months after marrying, discovers he's going to be sent to Chechnya. This is like 1991. His wife doesn't want to leave Germany. She's German. And Kovtun doesn't want to go. So he deserts in Germany in 1991 and claims asylum. And he ends up in this hostel for asylum seekers in Hamburg. He drinks heavily. And his wife has a great description of him. She says, he had all sorts of dreams and plans, none of which he realized, however. Dmitry wanted to be a porno star. I mean,
hold on, that came out of nowhere. You just like kind of dropped that in. Was that was his wife saying that?
That was his wife.
That's a quote from his wife. Okay.
I mean, it's one thing for your wife to go, he was a bit of a dreamer. He's always trying to come up with schemes.
He's a bit of a dreamer, wanted to be a porno star. Yeah.
So bizarrely, that marriage breaks down.
Didn't see that coming.
But then he's in Germany. He marries again in Hamburg in 1996. He's living off benefits. He works, and this is part of the story we'll come back to. He works in a restaurant called Il Porto as a waiter, cleaning dishes. And his second wife says of him, I love these descriptions. Every woman finds Dmitry charming. It's just he does not fancy working and he's not a family man. He's more of a man about town. I had to do everything. I had to set up letters on the computer. He was not able to do this. Dmitry was no handyman. He could not even bang a nail into the wall.
These are devastating quotes from the ex-wives.
Well, I think we're getting a picture of Kovtun here.
So Kovtun, though,
he goes back to Moscow.
He goes back.
And he gets involved in technical surveillance, so bugging. And of course, he knows Lugovoi. So Lugovoi is going to, in 2005, say, well, maybe you can help me out with your surveillance skills for my security firm. So we've got this relationship between Lugovoi and Litvinenko. We'll talk about layers of this story. And this is where we get to this, I think, the deepest layer. We hinted at it earlier, this idea Litvinenko is also potentially pitching at people on behalf of MI6. And he, Litvinenko, is going to realize that Lugovoi could be useful, potentially, to be pitched at. I've looked at this and I've investigated it, and it is murky. My sense of this is that this is not MI6 tasking him to do this. He's a kind of consultant on organized crime. But he's trying to prove himself to be useful to them. So he is, to some extent, almost freelancing at points, asking people, suggesting people to MI6, trying to kind of broker contacts. So he's not a spy. I mean, I don't know. Is he what you'd call an access agent? I'm not sure, but it's an interesting role.
I don't find the definitional point to be that murky. I think he is acting as an agent. He's being paid, as we said, he's being paid £2,000 a month from MI6. It's going directly to his bank account. As part of that, I could imagine at any point an MI6 officer sitting down with him somewhere in London, and depending on what operations MI6 has going in Moscow, I could see them asking all kinds of questions of Litvinenko about where certain people fall, or their political beliefs, their connections, their network. There's all kinds of questions that it's not that he's providing foreign intelligence that's then being written up in a report and is being incorporated into an analytic product like a Gordievsky, right? He's not that. He doesn't have, ongoing access inside the FSB. But if you're trying to get a sense of the networks and the kind of social context, the familial context for people, the background, the history, it's almost implausible to me that MI6 wouldn't have sat down with him and tasked him for that kind of information.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's an agent. He's just not in Russia and he's just not providing FI, but he's an agent.
There is one report which will come out later, and it's only in the Russian media, so it could be disinformation, can't be sure about it, but there'll be a major in the Russian tax police who will claim that Litvinenko in 2002 had introduced him, this major in the Russian tax police, to an MI6 officer who then starts paying him €2,000 a month for consulting services, and that they have, the major has meetings with MI6 over whiskey in third countries like Turkey and Finland, Litvinenko sometimes attending, and that he's provided with a mobile phone or a special SIM card. So there are these claims that he's involved in this kind of spy work. The people I spoke to are obviously very careful about what they say, but the sense I get is he was not easy to control. He was often doing his own thing, trying to prove his worth. I think senior people in British intelligence from the time, I think, concede they weren't always aware enough of what he was doing and some of the risks he was taking and some of the things that are going on, because this is where it gets back to Lugovoi. Because Litvinenko looks like he was trying to provide access to Andrei Lugovoi for British intelligence. Now, maybe doing it off his own back, maybe at their instigation, that's a bit unclear. But we know about this because Lugovoi himself later talks, and you've got to, take it with a pinch of salt, but I also think there's reason to think it's plausible. Lugovoi will later talk about being approached by MI6. These claims get dismissed later, but it's him muddying the water, trying to kind of, make it sound like MI6 was behind the murder and things like that. But the suggestion is that Lugovoi is introduced to British intelligence. And Lugovoi will claim, he will later say, it began to dawn on me that these meetings for business consultancy, which had been set up, were not...
Slowly, it began to dawn on me that...
maybe this is... He's being paid through an offshore company in Cyprus. And then he says, I was alarmed because it was public domain information which could be easily found on the internet. It became clear, Lugovoi will say, that the purpose of the remuneration was to involve me gradually into cooperation. Now, I have to say, this is, I don't know what you think, but we know this is how spy services work, don't they? They do this thing where they'll lure people in for business consultancy. Just remember that next time you get asked. And you get overpaid for some bits of information, but it's about establishing a relationship, and then you slowly dial up how secret or how sensitive the information is. That does feel plausible, and that's what happened with Lugovoi.
Does it make sense that MI6 would want to recruit Lugovoi?
I think he's got contacts in the FSB. He's running a security company in Moscow. He's being asked to do things. I mean, that's kind of interesting, I'd have thought. He's going to pick up stuff on who's close to Putin, what's going on, who's got business rivalries or animosity because they're employing him to spy on the other one. That could be all useful information.
He's got a company, so he could provide all kinds of services, cover services, things like that for agents or officers who want to go in and out. Yeah, all kinds of interesting things you could do with a guy like that.
I think so. And so he's going to claim that the Brits were trying to gather dirt on President Putin and his family and incriminate people or do things like that. Who knows? Hard to know. And there's definitely a bit of him trying to smear MI6 afterwards. So you have to slightly aim off at least a little bit. But he's going to claim, again, these are claims from Lugovoi, he's given a special phone by MI6 officers who he meets that he's to use when calling from Moscow. But here's the thing. He says, well, when the British agent started approaching me, one of the first things that I did was to inform the FSB so they wouldn't accuse me of being a traitor or a spy. Now, that may be true, but equally, as we said before, maybe he was already working for the FSB, having been turned around the time of that prison sentence in 2002.
Yeah.
But even if he hadn't been turned earlier, he's definitely now telling the FSB he is being recruited or attempting to be recruited by MI6, and the person who put them in touch was Litvinenko. I mean, that's a big deal, isn't it?
And of course, Litvinenko and British intelligence think that they're cultivating Lugovoi as some kind of agent. At the same time, though, what's more likely, I think we're saying going on, is that Lugovoi, he's already acting as an FSB agent, and he is effectively using this access to this community of Russians in London to feel out the Putin opposition. and to penetrate
Yeah.
the Putin opposition and report that back to Moscow. And I guess after this set of interactions, what the Russians now think is that former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko is in the middle of this swirl and is working actively with MI6 to penetrate Russia and Russian institutions, right? So
Yeah.
I think what we've established, Gordon, is that there's a lot of different reasons for Putin and the Russian state to want Alexander Litvinenko out of the picture.
And then at this point, so now we're getting into 2006, and this is where everything starts to heat up. So the due diligence work as well is going to get more sensitive. One of the companies, Titan, asked Litvinenko in the summer of 2006 to do a report on a senior Russian politician called Viktor Ivanov, former KGB man, risen with Putin from St. Petersburg, becomes head of the Federal Anti-Narcotics Agency. You know, someone's thinking of doing a deal with him. They want to know about him. First report Litvinenko hands over about him was only a third of a page long and not very good. And it had been co-authored with Lugovoi.
It's really short. It's really short.
It's not very good, is it?
A couple paragraphs.
I mean, yeah. So he's been doing this work with Lugovoi, and it's a pretty crappy report. And the guy who runs the company is like, that's not good enough. And he meets Lugovoi as well, and he's like, I don't like this guy. So Litvinenko is told, go do another report. So this time he turns to Yuri Shvets, former KGB officer who now lives in America. So Litvinenko, the Lugovoi cooperation created a crappy third of a page report. Now he does something with Shvets, and it's like 8 pages. But here's the thing. Litvinenko, late September, gives this 8-page version that he's done with Shvets to Lugovoi and says, hey, this is how you do it. This is how you write a really good due diligence report with loads of, interesting information on Russian politicians. And he's given it to Lugovoi. And Shvets, when he finds out, is furious. He's like, what are you doing? This is dangerous. Handing out this stuff. It should be confidential. And the report leads to the collapse of a business deal and losses of, it's thought, between $10 and $15 million.
For Ivanov.
For Ivanov or for Putin's friends, yeah. So now you're also getting a kind of insight into the other motives that are going on, because Litvinenko's reporting for due diligence is costing people millions of dollars. And Lugovoi knows about it. Lugovoi flies back to Moscow. And of course, what happens? That report about Ivanov, written with Shvets and Litvinenko, find its way to the FSB. He'll say, I was stopped at the airport. They found it on me. More likely he gives it to the FSB because he's working for them. Either way, it now means the FSB and probably Ivanov himself know Litvinenko is producing reports which are kind of crashing business deals, for them, which are costing them, millions and millions of dollars. So you've got another motive now, haven't you?
We've got a commercial motive because the due diligence is costing Putin allies money. We have a political motive because Litvinenko has essentially said that, and he's published a book that says that Putin and the people around him are responsible for the apartment bombings. And I guess we have a sort of counterintelligence or security motive because Litvinenko is an access agent, a social broker of some kind, a consultant for MI6. So there's a lot of reasons to do it. So as we get into the middle of 2006, Litvinenko has been in the UK for how many years?
5 to 6 years.
It's heating up. There's been this kind of build. Maybe in isolation, none of these things were quite important enough for the Russian state to order a hit, but all of them together, by the time we get to 2006, it's just, this is a guy who's causing problems on many different fronts, and time to act.
Time to act. I mean, it's the thing. Sometimes you're looking for a motive. I think in the case of Litvinenko, you don't have to look that hard. It's choosing which one or trying to work out which one of many, because there just are so many reasons why the Russian state might want to kill him. But what's interesting is once you get to this point, the intensity really starts to build of these different strands coming together. He's getting repeated messages and phone calls from Russia, sometimes passed through intermediaries, threatening him, telling him to come back, warning him he's not safe. We talked about how the FSB views him as a traitor, back to that famous press conference he gives. I mean, they even use pictures of Litvinenko for target practice at a special forces training center. I find that really interesting.
Wow.
It does suggest he was pretty well known within the Russian security establishment as a hate figure if they're using his picture. So you've got this sense of animosity. He's becoming more vocal in his attacks on Putin under Berezovsky's patronage. Berezovsky is getting more involved in plotting Putin's overthrow. There's lots of plotting going on around him, of which he's part of. There's also little things which could also act as triggers. We talked a bit about the personal antagonism that Litvinenko has with Putin, going back to that meeting in the FSB. Then in July 2006, Litvinenko publishes this article on the Chechen press website. In fact, his writing for that tells you something as well. And it's a really strange article. It couldn't have been more inflammatory or designed to antagonize Putin, because it accuses President Putin of being a paedophile. I mean, it uses an incident where Putin kisses the stomach of a small boy publicly and claims that this is a sign that he's a paedophile and this has been covered up. I mean, there is no evidence actually to support this. There is no basis for it. It's a really incendiary claim. You know, he's always been quite obsessive, but he's becoming even more inflammatory in some ways.
Well, Litvinenko is prone to conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking. I mean, at one point, he had actually tried to blame the 7/7 bombings in 2005, which occurred at London, on the FSB.
Yeah.
So does it discredit him more broadly, these kind of wild claims?
I don't know if it discredits him, but it's
nuts, you know, to claim publicly that Putin's a pedophile.
I think he's drawn to trying to wake people up to Putin and to the FSB and making pretty outrageous claims to try and do that. Then, of course, there's the due diligence work. We talked about the business deal. So there's, you know, and the work he's potentially doing with MI6, trying to tap up Lugovoi, his business partner in due diligence, to work for MI6. Lugovoi's told the FSB. And at the same time, it's worth saying Russia is also changing. It's becoming more aggressive. 2 big new laws get passed in Russia in 2006, in March and July. Now, ostensibly, they're about counterterrorism and extremism. And one particularly follows the killing of 5 Russian diplomats by a Chechen supporting terrorist group in Iraq. And the laws allow Russia to go after terrorists and extremists anywhere around the world. Now, the issue, of course, is who do you interpret? Who's a
terrorist?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I guess seen from Russia, a former FSB officer who's claiming that Putin's a pedophile and who's also working for MI6 and cratering business deals for your buddies.
He's an extremist.
He'd fit in that category. If you're Putin.
Yeah. So in July 2006, after the second law is passed, the Times newspaper in London publishes a letter written by Vladimir Putin, who's a dissident, talked about him earlier, and Oleg Gordievsky, friend of the show, former KGB officer. And it's ahead of a meeting in St. Petersburg of the G8, where Putin's going to be there along with Western leaders. And these 2 Russian exiles say the stage is set for any critic of Putin's regime here, especially, meaning London, especially those campaigning against Russian genocide, as they put it, in Chechnya, to have an appointment with a poison-tipped umbrella. So these are people warning. We know about poison-tipped umbrellas, don't we, David? Well, not personally.
Not personally. And what year was that?
Late 70s, 78? Yeah. But this idea that Russians are capable of killing people, there's a warning there. And Marina says Alexander Litvinenko viewed these laws as a personal threat. So you can see that Litvinenko is becoming more aggressive, doing more things, and Russia's becoming more aggressive in its response. And so now as we get to October, as the net is closing around him, and we're going to really dive quite deep into those final weeks, the first thing that happens is one of his own friends is killed. Now, Anna Politkovskaya was a crusading Russian journalist on the Novaya Gazeta newspaper, which is an independent newspaper. Big critic of Putin. She'd investigated FSB, human rights abuses in Chechnya. She's a friend of Litvinenko, visits him in London. She is shot by gunmen outside her Moscow apartment, 7th of October 2006. And this really was it was a big deal, I think, for us journalists as well at the time, because she was a kind of prominent campaigner, investigator, and just shot. And Litvinenko breaks down when he hears the news, and he will believe Putin is responsible.
Well, October of 2006 is also a big month for Litvinenko because he's granted UK citizenship at a ceremony on the 13th of October. I think that when he came to London, he took his son to the Tower and basically said, "This country took you in," and never forget, right, that the UK has saved us. He's flying an English flag from his home's balcony during the World Cup that summer.
He's got British citizenship. It makes him very happy. Marina says he's very proud to be British, proud for his son to be British, and this was his future. Now, after this citizenship ceremony, I mean, he gives you a sense of the intensity of these days. Just gets his citizenship. Then he goes to a memorial event in Westminster for Politkovskaya, the journalist. And he takes his son, Anatoly, along, and he sees these other dissidents there, his old friends, and he says to one, I just received my citizenship. Now they will not be able to touch me. And to Bukovsky, he says, it makes me more secure, doesn't it? It protects me. And Bukovsky answers, I had to smile and say, well, not much, not really. I mean, the tragedy is he's just got his citizenship, but he actually only has weeks left to live.
And just 3 days later, his assassins will arrive, Kovtun and Lugovoi, arrive in London on the 16th of October, so just a few days after Litvinenko has been made a UK citizen.
Yeah, and it's Kovtun's first time in London. Lugovoi's been there for these business meetings before. They fly from Moscow to Gatwick Airport, just south of London, arrive 10:48 a.m. A policeman, interestingly enough, thinks they look suspicious and actually questions them and remembers them being evasive. But they give a phone number for business meetings they've got, which checks out, and they're eventually allowed to go in. There's not much you can do. They're going to stay at the Best Western in Shaftesbury Avenue, £300 a night back in 2006. I mean, not cheap, London hotels. They change into some business clothes on arrival at the hotel, which the staff think look very Russian. Shiny suits and big chunky jewellery. I think they look like the Russian mob, basically. Then that afternoon, they meet Litvinenko and one of these business due diligence contacts at the boardroom. They're discussing the possible deal with Gazprom. The room's not very big, room for about 6 chairs or so, tea and coffee on the table. Lugovoi suggests Litvinenko and others have a drink, seems quite insistent. And we will come back later to evidence the police will find that the Russians did try and poison Litvinenko at this meeting, at this moment. But the problem is he doesn't drink anything. So it's the first attempt and it's a miss. After that, 3 Russians go to Itsu. Ever been to Itsu? Sushi place. It's like a chain sushi place in Piccadilly. And this particular Itsu sushi place is going to be an important scene for the investigation. So it's worth remembering that. Litvinenko then goes home. Marina had prepared spicy chicken soup for dinner. Litvinenko liked hot food and he ate the soup with some hot peppers. But then sometime after the meal, he starts to feel a little bit ill and he vomits, throws up his food, but just once. And Marina will say, continue to feel a little bit unwell for the next 2 days, but not that bad. Bit of an upset stomach. Lugovoi and Kovtun, though, go out for dinner. Fancy place in Mayfair. Oysters, grilled lobster and tuna steaks. Then they go to a bar and they buy a shisha pipe at a bar. It's another kind of Russian mobster thing to do. No offense to anyone out there who has shisha pipes.
No offense to the Russian mobsters who obviously listen to the rest of
I meant the general listeners who might have one of those. So that's that day, their first day there. Next day, Tuesday 17th. This is it. This is where it also gets interesting when you get to the detail. The detail's so interesting because Lugovoi and Kovtun move from the Best Western Hotel to the Parks Hotel in Knightsbridge for the second of their 2 nights. Now, this is even though they'd booked for 2 nights at the first hotel and they paid for it and they don't ask for a refund. And this will later be thought to be because they'd contaminated the room with a poison. They'd potentially poured it down the sink. And they were like, I don't think we want to stay here for another night. And so that looks to be why they suddenly move. So here they are, new hotel. They meet a businessman who they're doing some work for. They meet Litvinenko again at the offices of Risk, one of the due diligence firms. They're working on this vodka case. Litvinenko here says he only drinks green tea and a glass of Coke at the restaurant, but he says the other 2 have been drinking. He'd been offered some, but he refuses, goes into a bar, doesn't like it. He's home by 11.
Litvinenko sounds like he's not having a lot of fun with these guys.
I think what's happening is, and we'll come back to these guys are like, we're in London from Moscow, it's party time. And Litvinenko, his wife's at home, his son's at home, he's a family man. It's like, I don't want to do this. I've got to do a bit of it with the business guys. You know, I mean, we all know those business meetings where someone is out for a good time and you're like, I just want to go home to bed.
It's time to go home. I mean, it also sounds like Kovtun and Lugovoi, as we've gone through their itinerary, they haven't been working very hard. Let's be honest. No. I mean, they've mostly been drinking and eating out. Yeah.
And this is the next detail. It's great because Lugovoi earlier in the day had asked at this hotel reception for a recommendation for a place where he and Kovtun could meet girls. Now, the receptionist suggests a place across the road, which was a brothel. I think the receptionist knows exactly what these two Russians are after. And also, and this is one of those details which is just nuts, a particular Italian pizza restaurant where the receptionist says you can have pizza with extras. And I don't know, but when I'm asking for extras on my pizza, it's anchovies normally, or maybe olives.
You're not normally led to a back room of the pizza shop, but this is an Italian pizza restaurant that is also
with extras,
a brothel.
Yeah, but then instead they don't go to that place because Lugovoi and Kovtun now go to a bar called Hey Joe, which I think is what is called a gentleman's club, David. A gentleman's club.
Is that what you call them in the UK?
Yeah, but not the gentleman's club of like, the Reformed travelers. Yeah, not that. This is a particular type of gentleman's club, which I learned reading the reports into this, had mirrors, dance floors, and cubicles. And supposedly this detail, I should say, comes from Luke Harding's book, A Very Expensive Poison, because I've never been to Hey Joe's, just to clarify that, because Hey Joe's also included a bronze phallus somewhere and a penis-shaped tap in the bathroom. This is a different world from our normal world. But these guys, they go to Hey Joe's and they get back to the hotel at 3 a.m., 10 a.m. the next morning. They check out and head back to Moscow.
What a business trip they've had. What a business trip. I mean, these guys, just to sum it up, what they have done over this 3-day run is gentlemen's clubs, drinking, eating out, and attempted murder. And then they go home hungover to Moscow after sleeping for 3 hours. I mean, what a trip. What a trip.
And not the last trip they will take, because Lugovoi is going to return just a week later on a BA flight this time, but just alone without Kovtun. And he books for flights and hotels only the day before. So this is interesting because this isn't clearly a pre-planned business trip. He's doing it in a hurry. Perhaps one could surmise because they didn't manage to achieve what they really wanted to achieve on the first business trip. So he's going to book into room 848 of the Sheraton Hotel. He meets, no, I can't say his name. He meets a Georgian businessman in Surrey who is a friend of Berezovsky and who'd co-run the TV channel where he worked. As a footnote, this Georgian businessman, Badri Patakatishvili, got it right that time, is found dead later in 2008. Maybe a heart attack, maybe not, who knows. But another one of those, if you're keeping count, it's another one of those people we meet who ends up dead. Lugovoi also sees Berezovsky during this trip. In fact, he sees Berezovsky in person. I think it's interesting. Suggests, they're still close, goes shopping, has some business meeting, meets Litvinenko at his hotel bar early evening of the 27th. Litvinenko drinks tea, Lugovoi red wine. They discuss the plan for Lugovoi to come with Litvinenko to Spain in November to do this work on, the Russian mafia in Spain, bring down the Russian mafia. It's all kind of interesting. At this point, there's no sign, no evidence that Lugovoi tried to poison Litvinenko when they're drinking together. And the reason, and we'll come back to the evidence for this later, because it looks like something's gone wrong for Lugovoi. It looks like he may have spilled the poison he's using in the bathroom at the hotel in which he's staying. We'll come back to the future how he does it. And so it means it's another fail. The trip is over. He's got to go back to Moscow having failed to do it. It's going to need to come back again.
Well, we'll come back to this poison spill. It just feels insane to me that the most valuable thing you've brought with you on the trip, it's like Inspector Clouseau, like when you just spill the thing in the bathroom. I know. It's remarkable.
I mean, there is a bit of them, which is, and I find it interesting with Lugovoi and Kovtun because there's an element of clownishness with their phallus clubs, gentlemen's clubs, and spilling poison. And yet, as we'll see, the guy's a killer. I mean, allegedly. Okay. Allegedly.
Yeah, good job.
Sorry.
Good job, Gordon. Yeah.
Yeah, that covered me legally. But, that's the thing. It's this weird mix. And I think you often see it with these Russian cases, don't you? Where they're both kind of clownish. We'll see it again with the, other poisonings in the future. And dangerous. And that's these guys. So 2 attempts. One more still to come.
It's the 31st of October, 2006, and Lugovoi has returned to London with his wife, 2 daughters, an 8-year-old son in tow, as well as a few friends. For what else, Gordon, but a football match? And this is Arsenal versus CSKA Moscow. Is that right?
Yeah. You a big fan of the Arsenal?
No, they're Bin Laden's team, though, right?
They are, and Keir Starmer.
And Keir Starmer, yeah.
Lugovoi is also, well, he's a CSKA Moscow fan.
He's not an Arsenal fan.
He's not with Bin Laden and Keir Starmer in the stands.
That's right.
Now, this is interesting, I think, because he's here with his family. He's here with his daughters, his son, also some friends, and they'd planned this holiday. But at the very last minute, Kovtun is added to the trip. At the very last minute. The decision to bring Kovtun is taken midway during Lugovoi's previous stay, when he's at this hotel where he spills the poison. Now, does that seem suspicious to you? I mean, halfway through a trip in which you may have spilled some poison, you go, I might need you to come for the next trip. I mean, you can see when you look at it in hindsight what's going on there, can't you?
You can. There's also, this is making me think that there is a set of interactions that we're not going to be able to talk about because I don't think anyone has ever unearthed any evidence around them, which is the interaction between Lugovoi and Kovtun and the supplier of the poison back in Russia.
I agree.
Who is probably like,
again,
these guys keep spilling the poison. They keep coming back. You know, we have a failed attempt. I wonder what Lugovoi told them had happened on the trip where he had spilled the poison, because I'm going to guess he didn't admit to spilling the poison.
No, I agree.
In the bathroom. I would like to see that interaction, though. Wonder how that went down.
The likelihood is he spilt it on the second trip, and he now realizes this social trip with his family is going to have to be another murder attempt, and it'll help to have Kovtun coming along. Kovtun comes up with all kinds of weird stories that he's coming to London by chance or that there's a business meeting. It's very confusing. But the assumption is that he's been asked. Now, Kovtun has been in Hamburg, and he flew there on October the 26th. And something very interesting happens here, according to German police who investigate it later. Kovtun is there to see his ex-wife and kids. We talked about he used to work at this restaurant, this place called Il Porto. One of the people he worked with as a waiter at Il Porto in the mid-90s, which is in the harbour area of Hamburg. He gets in touch with them. They'd kept in touch after they both left. They meet up to play chess, interesting enough, have a beer. Kovtun telephones him on Monday, October the 30th, and asks if they could meet. They go for a walk after eating. And I mean, this is wild. Do you want to read this bit?
Yeah, sure. This is from his friend in Hamburg. Dmitry asked whether I knew Litvinenko or had heard of him. I answered no. Dmitry said word for word, quote, Litvinenko was a traitor. There is blood on his hands. I went on to say that Litvinenko does deals with Chechnya, and then he asked me whether I knew a cook who was working at London. And then he tells him a name, which has been anonymized as C2. It's witness C2, who was a cook at Il Porto who had gone to England. And he goes on to say, I cannot remember the exact words. Dmitry said that he had a very expensive poison and needed the cook to administer it to Litvinenko. I cannot remember whether Dmitry said he had the poison. I did not take seriously what Dmitry said. I thought it was just talk.
Yeah.
And then the friend is later asked by German police to remember the exact details, and he says this. Kovtun said, I need this cook to put poison in Litvinenko's food or drink. He also said the poison is very expensive. As I have said already, I did not take him seriously. I said to him he was crazy. It would be much easier to shoot Litvinenko, I said jokingly. Kovtun said after that, it is meant to set an example. I answered that he should stop this nonsense.
I mean, Kovtun, we should say, will dispute this, and also the witness will not be willing to repeat it when asked to testify, because they don't want to get involved in it for reasons you can kind of understand. And I mean, Kovtun, I mean, again, it's this kind of sense, slightly idiocy of Kovtun to just tell this other waiter.
So Kovtun has told a friend, I mean, he's in contact with this guy, but it's a friend who's in Hamburg, so he's not like a super close associate. Kovtun has basically said, there's a hit out on this guy. I'm in charge of the poison. Do you know someone in London who will help me administer it?
Yeah.
It's really, from an operational security standpoint, an unwise an unwise thing to do.
It doesn't take a former CIA officer to tell me that is bad tradecraft. I think that's bad tradecraft. Telling random former waiters about your plot to assassinate someone with a very expensive poison. And so he's given the name of this chef who's supposedly an Albanian in London. Kovtun then heads straight from Hamburg to London. He gets an early flight. 6:30 a.m. He goes to the hotel to meet Lugovoi. Now, Lugovoi and his family are staying at this place called the Millennium Hotel, just across from what was then the US Embassy. David, you must have been there.
I've stayed at the Millennium Hotel.
Oh, have you?
I have.
Wow.
Yes. I stayed there on a liaison trip to visit with British counterparts. It was years, of course, later than this.
Yeah. Lugovoi is going to call Litvinenko, trying to arrange a meeting. Kovtun's arrived. He's got his own. He's not actually even got his own room. He's sharing with one of Lugovoi's friends, which again is a bit weird.
They're all there for the football match, right?
And then suddenly Kovtun at the last minute has pitched up. So they're like, okay, you stay with this other guy. So now we come to the crucial day, November the 1st, 2006. Lugovoi books his family on the big bus sightseeing tour of London at 10:26 a.m. I mean, it's again, these details are just bizarre, aren't they? Got to get him out of the way, I guess, one way.
Yeah, exactly. He needs an activity to get everyone out of his way for a few hours.
He's going to meet Kovtun. They're going to call Berezovsky. They're going to go to some business meetings in the morning. They're going to call the chef. So this Albanian chef, who they, El Porto Kovtun has, been connected to, but he's busy. They say, okay, we'll call you back. And immediately after they call the chef, Lugovoi calls Litvinenko. It's close to midday. And Lugovoi will later claim that it was Litvinenko which called him, but the phone records show they're calling Litvinenko. And it looks like they'd originally planned to meet the next day, but Lugovoi is asking to bring the meeting forward. Maybe it's they've got no chef, having a problem getting the chef, they're going to do it themselves. Litvinenko had been at home that day. He heads into town. First, he meets a boss from one of the due diligence companies. But then he gets an unexpected call from our friend Mario Scaramella. Remember him from earlier on? So the guy who was working on the Italian Matrokin Commission, the consultant there. And Scaramella says he wants to meet urgently. A little bit suspicious. He wants to meet right now, that afternoon, today. So he and Litvinenko meet at Piccadilly Circus. And Scaramella always likes a bit of a spy tradecraft. He's into, he's one of those people. But he's much more nervous than usual. Some might think suspiciously nervous. Let's eat, the Italian says. So they go to Itsu. Itsu
the sushi place.
Again, the same sushi place at 3 p.m. for half an hour. Now, this meeting is fascinating because Scaramella's handing over some documents, but he's also passing on news he's had from a contact. And the news is that there is a hit list of people who are thought to be enemies of Russia who are going to be eliminated. And Scaramella's source has told him that the killings have already started. And Alla Polotkovskaya was one of those on the list. And of course, we were talking about the fact she had been just killed a few weeks earlier. Scaramella says his name is on this hit list. Boris Berezovsky is on this hit list. And so is Litvinenko. And Scaramella says some people might be shot and some people might be poisoned with radioactive thallium, Scaramella has been told. He is really worried and he's telling Litvinenko to warn him. I mean, it's a weird, interesting coincidence, but somehow word is getting round. But Litvinenko seems to think, well, I'm always getting warnings. Who knows?
So right after this warning, what Litvinenko then does is he heads to meet the poisoners, Kovtun and Lugovoi, calling them to say he's on the way. Now, Kovtun and Lugovoi have gotten back at their hotel. It's around 3 p.m. At 3:30, there's CCTV footage of the two of them, of Kovtun and Lugovoi, going separately to the toilets by reception at the Millennium Hotel.
And then at 4 o'clock, Litvinenko arrives. We're going to go into this in real detail because it's important. Lugovoi approaches Litvinenko in reception and says, we're meeting at the bar. And he takes him over to the Pine Bar, which is the kind of wood panel bar just next to reception. Don't know if you drank there? David, in your time? Maybe not.
I don't remember it. I don't remember.
Yeah.
Maybe by this point there was a warning to not go to the Pine Bar because of
what happened.
Washing out the pipes.
One interesting fact is there are CCTV cameras everywhere in this hotel, all around reception, none in the Pine Bar. Pine Bar's crowded. There are two small tables pulled together, and Lugovoi guides Litvinenko to these tables. Now, Kovtun is initially away on the phone. Litvinenko sits opposite Lugovoi, kind of diagonally opposite. Lugovoi had been there for a while already and had ordered drinks, and he'll end up racking up more than a £70 bill covering cigars and champagne cocktails. It's back to the fancy lifestyle. So they begin talking about a business meeting they're going to have the next day. Lugovoi's in a rush because he needs to get to the football with his family. He says he doesn't have long. A waiter comes over to the table. Lugovoi says to Litvinenko, if you want to order something for yourself, then you can, but we're leaving soon. There's still some tea left here, though. And Lugovoi indicates a teapot, which is already on the table. And there'd been an order for green tea with lemon and honey, which is Litvinenko's drink, basically. And the tea had been made in this large white porcelain pot behind the bar, but it's always left to customers to pour out. Lugovoi doesn't seem to push Litvinenko to drink it. Seems quite laid back about it, which is interesting, isn't it? He's not like going, have some tea, which I guess you wouldn't, would you?
Well, and they've already kind of pushed some drinks on him in earlier visits. So they're probably thinking, let's not do that again. It is also interesting because I don't think of either Lugovoi or Kovtun as tea drinkers, and yet they've got this pot of tea because they know that Litvinenko is.
It is kind of smart what they're doing because they've said they've got to go soon, so there's probably not time to order something. If Litvinenko orders something, he's probably worried, I'm then going to have to pay the bill.
Oh, yeah.
And it's expensive. You know, you don't want to get caught with a bill if you're Litvinenko, so he's kind of thinking, oh, well, you know, it's fine. They're talking about the plan that they're going to go to Spain together, Lugovoi and Litvinenko. And Litvinenko, as they're talking, pours out about half a cup of green tea. There wasn't much left in the pot, which suggests maybe it had been drunk, whatever. But he doesn't see anyone else drink from the same pot. Now, the tea is already cold, and he also normally has it with sugar. So he has a few sips, maybe 3 or 4 sips, and that's it. It just doesn't taste that nice because it's cold and it's not sweet enough. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, if he'd had more, then the long drawn-out death which he's going to face would have been much quicker. And actually, the whole story could have been quite different. No one else drinks from the pot. Kovtun comes back to the table. Just before 4:30, Lugovoi's friends and his wife and kids turn up in the lobby of the hotel. And the lobby is right next to the bar. The wife waves, and then something really odd happens. Lugovoi brings his 8-year-old son over to Litvinenko and says, this is Uncle Sasha, Sasha being the kind of name for Alexander, the diminutive. Shake his hand. They shake hands and the boy leaves. Interesting, isn't it?
I would not have, probably wouldn't have asked my 8-year-old son to shake the hand of the guy I just poisoned with a exceptionally powerful and radioactive poison, but I don't know. I just maybe I'm an overly protective father, Gordon. That just doesn't seem. It seems odd. It also, I guess, it suggests that Kovtun and Lugovoi maybe don't understand what sort of poison they've been given.
I think that feels right to me. I think they think it's something you're going to. I mean, they're right. It's something you put in a drink that you're going to ingest, but I don't think they understand its radioactivity and therefore that there's a risk of wider contamination, because otherwise you just wouldn't do it. You wouldn't bring your son over. But they have this encounter around 4:30, so about after half an hour or so in this Pine Bar. Litvinenko leaves. Litvinenko then goes to Berezovsky's office on Down Street, actually the same one I visited 4 years earlier. Maybe to show him the documents that Scaramella has given him, you know, all the stuff about plots, because of course there's plots against Berezovsky's life, as well as Litvinenko's, according to Scaramella. And then Ahmed Zakayev, the Chechen friend of them both, will drive Litvinenko home that evening, back to North London. He doesn't know it, but he's now a dead man walking. That night was the anniversary of Litvinenko and his family's arrival in the United Kingdom. So his wife, Marina, had cooked his favourite chicken. They eat, but then soon after going to bed that night, he rushes to the bathroom and throws up. And then again it happens 20 minutes later, and again, and there's a bit of foam and blood. By the early hours of the morning of November the 2nd, he says to Marina, he thinks he might have been poisoned. And during that day, he can't keep food or drink down. There's vomiting, there's stomach cramps. Interestingly enough, one of the people he calls that morning of November the 2nd is Andrei Lugovoi, the guy, who poisoned him in the Pine Bar. And he says he's got to cancel their meeting that they'd planned with the due diligence company because he's feeling ill. And then the next day, of course, Lugovoi and Kovtun, his partner, fly back to Moscow and leave the scene. Whether Litvinenko blames Lugovoi or thinks it's him, we'll come back to that because it's an interesting question. But Marina then calls an ambulance that night. So we now head into the night of November 2nd, early hours of November 3rd. Paramedics come, but they say he's just suffering a bacterial infection and should just drink more water. But things get worse during the day. And by 4 p.m., an ambulance is going to take him to Barnet Hospital in the North London suburbs.
And when he had first fallen ill, Litvinenko had asked Marina to bring a couple phones for him to the hospital. And on one phone, again, it's fascinating, isn't it? He makes a call to, again, Andrei Lugovoi. And Litvinenko, I guess he's thinking, like many of us would if we had fallen ill. We have work arrangements and commitments, and we need to start canceling things and moving things around. And so Litvinenko explains to Lugovoi that he won't be able to go on that trip to Spain, the business trip to Spain. It is interesting because Litvinenko seems to think at this point or suspect that he's been poisoned. I'm rocking some hindsight bias here, Gordon, but I would wonder if in the back of his mind he's thinking about Lugovoi, Kovtun, the tea and the Pine Bar, but he doesn't seem to really be behaving as if he believes that Kovtun and Lugovoi are his poisoners yet.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the realization, I think it might be there as a part of the swirl of possibilities. And of course, he's getting ill. So, his mind may not be working 100%. But I don't think he's settled on them as the killers. There are certainly other possibilities in his mind. And it's amazing. He's calling Lugovoi to say we can't go to Spain. He uses the other phone. So interesting. 2 phones Marina brings to Barnet Hospital. And he uses a different phone to call a guy called Martin. Now, the fact he's using a different phone is maybe a clue that Martin is someone interesting. And we'll come back to Martin because he's going to appear a little bit later in the story. But at Barnet Hospital now, there's this medical mystery which is unfolding and which is going to unfold over the next few weeks because they don't know what's wrong with him. And there's this initial diagnosis of gastroenteritis with mild dehydration, which they assume he's got because he's throwing up. But then the results of those initial blood tests show that although his platelet count was normal, his hemoglobin and white blood cell count were high. So he's put on antibiotics. But then they see his platelet count fall to an unusually low level. And then the red and white blood cell counts fall even further. And this is all a bit odd. It just doesn't fit the pattern for a normal illness. It's a mystery for the staff. And on November the 7th, Marina is going to ask a doctor if it could be poisoning. And she says to the doctor, he knows dangerous people, friends of ours have been poisoned. But the doctors at this point just don't take it that seriously.
It reminds me a little bit of the reaction to Georgy Markov being poisoned by the rice and tipped umbrella, that series we did last year, where these poisonings are so uncommon and the initial symptoms could be explained in so many different ways that the poisoning victims kind of get dismissed right off the bat. Just say, it's no way. This is something else. No way. It's kind of crazy. In retrospect, the doctor says it's unlikely. But then, Litvinenko from the hospital gives an interview to the BBC's Russian service where he says he's recovering from being poisoned. So whatever the medical staff says, he's decided at this point that it's poison.
And it's interesting because in that interview, I was looking at a transcript of it just earlier, he mentions he met someone the day of the poisoning, and he's talking about scaramella here. Mario Scaramella, the consultant on the Mitrokhin Commission, who he'd met in the Itsu sushi bar that day. And he's talking about him. He doesn't mention the others, Lugovoi and Kovtun. Now, whether it's because he's business partners, whether there's something else going on here, whether he doesn't suspect them, not entirely sure, but we're going to come back to that. But it's interesting. People, even his friends like Alex Goldfarb, who hears about this and hears about him being ill, are pretty skeptical about the poisoning. They'll come visit, they'll start to take it seriously. But the BBC Russian service interviews his attempt to get people interested in this. But at this point, it's just not breaking through. And in the meantime, he's getting worse. And that's the problem. November 12th, Marina, who's visiting every day, strokes his hair to comfort him. And she stares at her hand in horror because clumps of his sandy blonde hair are coming away as she strokes his hair. And he actually asks for it all to be shaved off. She keeps some of the hair, and that will actually come in useful. So the doctors are really confused because it just doesn't fit. I mean, it does strike one doctor that the symptoms were similar to a patient suffering from acute leukemia who'd been treated with intensive chemotherapy. So they'd had their total body irradiation done prior to a bone marrow transplant. So people are starting to kind of go through different theories, aren't they, about what it could be.
And now starting on the 14th and 15th of November. So, I mean, a couple weeks after he's been poisoned and started showing symptoms, the staff actually start testing for radiation, for poisoning. And they use a Geiger counter, which comes up with nothing. The reason being that it detects the wrong type of radiation inside him. It's looking for, gamma and more common types of radiation instead of the alpha radiation that is destroying his body. And the next day, the staff wonders, okay, well, maybe it's thallium poisoning. Symptoms sort of fit, but not quite. And then on the 15th, Scotland Yard is finally informed, which seems late to me, I have to say, but there's a lot of uncertainty swirling over the case in these first couple weeks.
That's right. And I think that reflects the fact they're not sure that it is poisoning. And it's only around the 15th that they think, okay, this really could be poisoning because nothing else explains it. Maybe we had better inform Scotland Yard. And he's going to be transferred on November 17th to University College Hospital, UCH Hospital, which is a big, recently built tower block in central London near Warren Street Tube. Professor John Henry, who's an internationally renowned toxicologist with an interest in rare poisons, is going to get involved and looking at it. He's going to talk to friends like Alex Goldfarb on the 18th and say, it does look like this thallium poisoning. And one of the reasons why that comes up is it is something that the Russians had used in the past, that the KGB, for instance, had used it in the late 50s. There's this Russian intelligence defector, Nikolai Kotlov, who defects in 1957. He's an assassin. And then he's actually poisoned with thallium, with a drink with thallium. So they think, oh, well, maybe that could be it. But it's still not quite fitting. But the key thing here is that the police are involved. And he's been trying to get people convinced of his poisoning and that happened. And finally, the police are going to turn up. They initially are actually on their way to Barnet Hospital on the 17th, but by the time they're on their way, they're told, no, he's being moved to UCH Hospital. Interestingly enough, it's two officers from the Murder Command, so the people who would deal with a regular criminal event. And the briefing they get is there's someone in a hospital claiming they've been poisoned, probably nothing. But it's going to change their lives, I think, for these policemen who go, because they turn up. So around midnight, just after midnight, so we're really into the early hours of the 18th, they're there, and a detective inspector from the Metropolitan Police's homicide team is sitting by Litvinenko's bed. And it's interesting because the medical team are still kind of dismissive of all this and give the police the impression they're getting in the way. And the police say to the medical team, well, can you guarantee he will still be alive tomorrow for us to talk to him? And the medical team have to go, well, we can't guarantee anything. And so the police go, well, then you may think we're getting in the way, but we're going to start these interviews right now because, we can't wait. We don't know what's going to happen.
Then in something that does feel very much out of a spy film, I guess, the two officers sit down in the room. They've got an old-fashioned tape recorder, not an iPhone, recording the conversation. There's a uniformed officer at the door, but no armed guard. And then Litvinenko starts in with his kind of like testimony, his last statement. He says, "I have name Alexander Litvinenko. I am former KGB FSB officer." And then he kind of goes on in this, faltering English and explains really his whole story. And the policemen kind of sit there rapt, and it's something that I'm sure they've never forgotten.
That's right, because they're going to sit there for hours as he tells them a story of his time in the FSB, of meeting Putin. And at this point, he's still alert. He can even occasionally get up from his hospital bed, walk around the room, but he's clearly in pain. He gets up at one point, they remember, and he looks out of the window across London, and he's thinking hard about the events that led to his illness. And he wants to share every detail with the police. And there are a lot of extraordinary aspects to this case, but one of them was the police have in front of them what one would call a living murder victim, a man who was dying, but who you could interview. And as with any murder inquiry, the key is to find the point of contact between the victim and the weapon that killed him. And normally you're reconstructing that. But here you can interview the person. You can say, tell us who you met. Mm-hmm. Tell us, what you did on that day. And I think because he's a former FSB officer, he's really good at recollecting things. He notices things, doesn't he?
He's been trained to take in the environment and to log details and anomalies and use that to build a picture of the world around him. And that's an immensely useful skill for these investigators. And it's interesting because pretty soon thereafter, Litvinenko focuses in on 3 suspects, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Who he thinks must have been involved in some way.
Because they're the 3 people he was with on the day he fell ill. And the 3 men are, first of all, Mario Scaramella, the person with whom he'd eaten at that Itsu sushi bar on the afternoon of the 1st of November. Also, Andrei Lugovoi and Dmitry Kovtun, who he'd met later in the Pine Bar. But it's interesting because at this point, he tells the police officer, Detective Inspector Hyatt, he says, although he'd spoken publicly, meaning the BBC interview, about his meeting with Scaramella, he hadn't talked about his meeting with Lugovoi and Kovtun. Now, he will say and suggest that that's partly because he doesn't want to tip them off. He doesn't want to show his hand that he knows it might be them, knowing that they probably left the country or that they have left the country. And he's hoping that might encourage them to come back. But he does seem to have told some close friends and associates at this point that he did think it might be Scaramella who'd done it. And so it is possible he's trying to play a clever game to lure Kovtun and Lugovoi back. But actually, others do think that he's also slightly embarrassed that if it was Kovtun and Lugovoi, he's made a mistake in his own judgment. I think that's also quite challenging for him. So initially, he is focusing, I think, a bit more on Scaramella.
What would have been Scaramella's motive? Scaramella seems like the least likely of the 3 because he's not going back and forth to Moscow.
There isn't an obvious motive, but I do think this sense in which Litvinenko is either publicly but maybe even privately wary of pointing the finger at the people who really did do it. Maybe, I mean, Yuri Shvets, this former KGB officer who Litvinenko knew, also thinks that Litvinenko was a bit embarrassed by the possibility that he had trusted his assassins.
Yeah.
Litvinenko was a professional. He was always saying he can identify an enemy a mile away. What if he'd really screwed up this time? So there is this slight tension about who he's accusing. But these interviews, this first interview, which happens with the police, it starts around midnight, goes on well past 2 a.m. And, you get to past 2 a.m. and the police officers are obviously getting a bit tired. And they ask Litvinenko, aren't you tired? You might be tired, he says. I'm happy to carry on. And it's only at 2:45 a.m. they finish that interview at UCH. I mean, it's amazing. And they're so intrigued by what they heard that they don't go back to the office or home or wherever they were due to go. But about 4 a.m, they're outside the Itsu sushi bar in Piccadilly, where Litvinenko met Scaramella because they just want to see it.
We need to put this sushi bar on our spy tour of London, Gordon. We'll start with a lunch at Itsu Sushi.
I think it's another place a bit like the Pine Bar, which doesn't like to talk about its radioactive past. So I think we'll have to be a bit careful about it. But it was definitely closed at 4:00 in the morning. But yeah, it just shows how the story must have really captured them, I think.
And this will be the first of 4 interview sessions that take place over the next 3 days. But Litvinenko, his condition is worsening. He's vomiting blood. His heartbeat's weakening. And then on November the 19th, he goes into the ICU.
Yeah. But despite this huge pain, he keeps talking to them, even though at one point the case, I think, was close to being abandoned as the police couldn't find any evidence of the deliberate poisoning. But he just wants to keep talking. And at 5 p.m. on November the 20th, a senior investigating officer, known in the police jargon as an SIO, is assigned to the case. And importantly, they're from the Counter-Terrorist Command, and that handles national security cases. And it's an officer called Detective Superintendent Clive Timmons. He's hardly ever spoken about this publicly, but we're going to be speaking to him. You're going to be able to hear from him in a bonus episode for our club members. So do join the Declassified Club if you want to hear. It's an extraordinary account of what it was like to be the lead investigator into this absolutely extraordinary case. And now, as well, outside the hospital, you've got public interest growing, particularly the media. Because
the media.
Here's where I come into the story, David. You'll be pleased to know. You've been waiting for that.
I have been waiting. Bated breath. When will Gordon Carrera's scoop come into the story? We're there at last.
Litvinenko. I didn't get the first interview. Actually, the first interview in his hospital bed had been done. The BBC Russian service did it, and then the Sunday Times journalist. And that appeared on the 19th of November. And that caused a big fuss. And I was actually going through my notes, and I could see that I did a report the next morning on the BBC on the 20th of November. And I'd already spoken to a source. I still, 20 years on, will be delicate about who that was, although I do think I know, who said that they thought he'd been poisoned. And at the time, I think they suggested to me it was more likely to be thallium. And they pointed to the fact that thallium had been used by Russians elsewhere in Europe, but not in the UK, they said. And they pointed me to the fact that they were seeing lots of Russian intelligence activity in the UK, not necessarily at Cold War levels, but not far off. And so at this point, I'm starting to cover the story, and lots of other people are. And I remember standing outside UCH Hospital in those days, reporting that inside Litvinenko was fighting for his life, and saying that. And so the media scrum is also really growing as this word spreads that there's a former Russian FSB officer who most people had never heard of, but claiming he'd been poisoned.
And the police are still doing their interviews, aren't they? I mean, they're still talking to Litvinenko as much as they can, given his condition. And I think this is fascinating because at the end of one of the tapes, the police officer asks, I guess, a very simple question, which is, can you think of anybody else who may wish to do this sort of harm to you? And Litvinenko, let's just say, he doesn't point the finger at the actual poisoners, let's say. He kind of, this is where I think to me, it's fascinating because he says, I have no doubt whatsoever that this was done by the Russian secret services. I know the order about such a killing of a citizen of another country on its territory, especially if it had something to do with Great Britain, could have been given only by one person. And then the police officer asks, would you tell us who that person is? That person is the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. So, pointing the finger in high places. He is.
Yeah, he thinks he knows who is ultimately responsible.
And Gordon, you've teed up this mysterious visitor, Martin, who I think all of our listeners know who Martin works for, but I think it's time that we tell them.
Yeah, exactly. He must have slipped past me while I was reporting outside, anonymously, as any good spy would. But yes, as at the second police hospital interview, Litvinenko's condition was clearly worse. The pair of officers are believing it's a poisoning now. And they asked Litvinenko whom he met the day before he fell ill. And Litvinenko says there was one meeting at 4 p.m. on October the 31st in Waterstone's bookstore in Piccadilly. But Litvinenko won't provide the man's name while the tape is running with the police. And the police, of course, go, it could be absolutely vital you tell us who that person is, because they're thinking, well, could it have been poisoned the day before? And Litvinenko says, you can call him and he will tell you. And at that point, I love the detail, the tape gets stopped. And you can find the transcripts for these tapes, so that's why we know exactly what happened. And it's 2 hours before it's turned on again, the tape recorder. And in those 2 hours, Martin has actually come and gone from the hospital room. And we know he embraces Litvinenko when he arrives, and it's clear that the pair know each other really well. And then the tape goes back on, and the officer asks if the person who'd just been in the hospital, Martin, was the man whom Litvinenko had met at Waterstones. And Litvinenko said he was. And then it's so interesting. The police officer says on the transcript, on the tape, I don't want to ask you what you talked about with that person. I mean,
that's wise. That's wise.
It's wise.
Yeah, he doesn't want to know.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because you can immediately sense that the police are realizing this case is kind of bumping up against MI6. And the fact clearly that Martin is an MI6 officer.
Shocking.
Who's
it's
come
a shocker.
To visit him.
I didn't see it coming. I didn't see it coming.
You'd love to know from Martin what they talked about.
Why? So it's been 2 weeks since he's been poisoned. Had Martin been visiting, or had there been interaction with Litvinenko up to that point with MI6, or no?
Well, I think there was definitely interaction because he'd called Martin with his special MI6 Martin phone when he'd first gone into Barnet that Marina had bought. So I think they'd been in touch, and it's entirely possible Martin had been visiting regularly in that period. And I think MI6 as well, my senses initially as well, were not willing to believe the idea he'd been poisoned, but increasingly are coming to that view. And of course, it is interesting that it's at this point, around this time, that the case is treated as a poisoning and handed to the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command, because we should explain to people that the Counterterrorism Command sounds like it does terrorism, but actually does anything national security related. And their officers are vetted, are cleared to see secret intelligence and therefore to work with MI5 and MI6. So you can see also the transfer of the case to Clive Timmins. It is also part of MI6 taking this seriously and the realization that there's going to be secret bits to investigating it.
Well, and now MI6 is trying to figure out what's going on. And the medical staff, the police, I mean, there are no answers at this point.
Yeah.
As what's actually affecting him. And what will be the last police interview comes on the evening of November the 20th. I mean, we're almost 3 weeks after the poisoning at this point. Litvinenko has been moved into intensive care that day. Got wires and monitors all around him. He's doesn't have any hair. It's been shaved off at this point. And he's lying there. And I think this is this, Gordon, when this I think it's a pretty iconic photo is taken of Litvinenko lying there in his green hospital gown.
Yeah. It's interesting. The photo is really interesting because he's got these people around him, Alex Goldfarb, people around Boris Berezovsky, who also understand this is becoming a big media story. There's public interest in this. It's important to get out the message that he's been poisoned. And one of the ways will be through a picture. Marina is quite reluctant about the picture, I think. She doesn't want to reveal to the world. You can understand why, can't you? That how ill he is, how he looks. But she agrees to have this picture taken, which is this iconic picture of him. Actually, it's a remarkable picture because he looks defiant somehow. It's that look of defiance he has, which I think is really powerful. So that's happening. The police officers are still there. They're getting to their last interview now with him. One thing he wants to talk about to them is the fact that just last month in October, he got his British citizenship. And he says to the police, I love this country and its people, although unfortunately I haven't learned English language completely yet. I'm proud to say I'm a British citizen. Yes, they did try to kill me and possibly I may die, but I will die as a free person and my son and wife are free people and Britain is a great country. Now, as that last interview is coming to an end, Litvinenko is asked if there's anything else he wants to say. And he remembers taking his son to the Tower of London, showing him the British crown and saying this is a country that you should defend. But he makes one last request for the police officers. And at this point, I mean, his condition is really worsening. He's actually struggling to talk because there's blisters on his throat. And he says to the police, I want you to pursue the case wherever it goes. And he says, I know there might be political interests which could get in the way. He's upset, for instance, that British political leaders, American political leaders are sitting round the table with Putin at the G8 summit and at other meetings. And he knows that that may cause things to be difficult. But he wants them to keep going. And at that point, the buzzer sounds signaling the tape is about to finish. And Litvinenko tells Brent Hyatt, the detective inspector, I trust you completely. Bring this case to an end as far as it's possible. And Brent Hyatt makes the Russian a promise. I will do absolutely everything within my power to ensure this case is properly investigated. And I think it is testament that in this case, the police don't let him down. They really will pursue this case.
But of course, Litvinenko is beginning to surrender to the radiation that is very much just cooking his body from the inside out. And it's on that Tuesday, the 21st of November, that this iconic photograph is taken, that defiant look at his eyes across his face, as you mentioned, Gordon. And it's still a mystery. What is afflicting him?
Yeah.
Litvinenko does not have any significant damage to his nerve endings, relatively low thallium levels. So it doesn't fit with the theory, of course, of thallium poisoning. And then on the 21st, the medical staff, the examiners shift to a theory that it could be radiation of some kind. And of course, at this point with him, he's not dead yet, but one tool in a murder inquiry is, of course, going to be a postmortem, which may shed light, the investigators think, on what is actually killing Alexander Litvinenko.
That's right. I mean, you normally carry out a post-mortem on someone who's died, but it's back to the idea of this being a really unusual murder inquiry in which the victim is still alive. And so Clive Timmons, this police officer who's in charge, orders what he describes as a living post-mortem, a battery of tests and examinations to try and find out what's happening. He holds up two pictures, one before where Litvinenko is fit and healthy, and one after where he's pale and emaciated. And he says, how did he go from that to this? And they're looking at everything. They're looking at, the Geiger counter hadn't shown up any radiation, but they do send a urine sample to the Atomic Weapons Establishment, AWE, which is at Aldermaston, a famous site, which builds the UK's nuclear weapons.
Probably not accustomed to receiving urine samples at the Atomic Weapons Establishment.
No, I don't know. Maybe they are. But it's a strange, interesting place where some of the most secret work goes on. So Litvinenko is struggling. He actually has 2 cardiac arrests, has to be resuscitated. But then something I find quite odd happens. During this time, these last days, effectively, Ahmed Zakayev, his Chechen friend, who's also in exile in London, comes to visit and brings an imam to Litvinenko's bedside. Now, Litvinenko had been technically baptized into the Russian Orthodox Church, but he'd so become, I guess, emotionally attached to the Chechen cause, he'd expressed a desire to convert to Islam. And they'd been talking about that while he was in Barnet Hospital. And so he's going to undertake a ceremony at this point. And Litvinenko's father, Walter, also arrives from Russia on this day, the 21st November. And Litvinenko tells his father about the conversion, and the father says, it doesn't matter, at least you're not a communist. Which is one way of seeing these things.
I would not have had, when we started this, I would not have had deathbed conversion to Islam on my bingo card. But no. Here we are.
It's kind of curious, strange detail, isn't it?
It comes out of nowhere, kind of.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. But I think it makes you realize how attached he'd become to the Chechen cause, which I think is also interesting. So now we get to November 22nd. There's a big meeting here of the police, Atomic Weapons Establishment people, medical consultants, Clive Timmons, the police officer in the chair. They go through all the possible options. Now that thallium has effectively been ruled out, some of them are really obscure, something called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. I've never heard of that. But I think they're having to go through really obscure things because nothing else fits. And then at this meeting, one person from AWE chirps up and says they'd found a tiny spike of polonium in the urine sample, but it was probably just cross-contamination from something else. And Clive Timmons goes, "You mean plutonium?" People think, well, we've never heard of this. It seems really obscure and bizarre. So they say, well, to test properly, we need a litre of urine to see if there's any real evidence rather than just a small sample.
It's a lot of urine.
"You are taking the piss," said Timmons bluntly, meaning how are we going to get a litre of urine because he's not producing any? And only then realizing the slight irony of his words, because Litvinenko has stopped eating and drinking and not producing any urine, but actually they kept a sample, fortunately, from a week earlier, which gets sent off here on the 22nd. There's a filmmaker who comes in to see Litvinenko and takes some video. It's only released later, and it's really haunting. I mean, it's very different from the ghostly defiant image. This is him just looking, terrible. There's wires everywhere. And then there's this 8 p.m., the evening of the 22nd November. Marina is there, but she tells him she has to go. She has to go home. They've got their son. She feels guilty. "Don't worry," she says, "I'll be back tomorrow." And he just says, "I love you so much." And those are the last words he speaks to her.
The results are confirmed. It's polonium contamination. And the staff at AWE call Clive Timmons just after 3 p.m. to tell him. And he's, they say he's dead. And no, he's not. He's alive. Clive's thinking, no, they explain he's absolutely going to die. Nobody survives this. And so the mystery is solved. He's still alive. The mystery is solved. But now he just has hours left to live.
That's right. So it's at 8:51 p.m. on Thursday, the 23rd of November, that Litvinenko suffers a third cardiac arrest. An ICU consultant on duty tries to resuscitate him, doesn't work, and at 9:21 p.m. he's pronounced dead from multiple organ failure. So the news is going to get out, and after his death, a statement that he'd agreed to just before he died is going to be read on the steps of the hospital the following day by Alex Goldfarb, his friend, one of the people who'd got him out on his journey to London. Now, Marina, like with the photograph, had been cautious about this idea of the statement because she'd always hoped he'd survive. And she'd said that preparing this statement to be read in the event of his death was like giving up. But now it's there and it's read out. And I think it's worth reading it all, isn't it, David? Because I think it's a really powerful statement. "I thank my wife, Marina, who has stood by me. My love for her and our son knows no bounds. But as I lie here, I can distinctly hear the beating of wings of the angel of death. I may be able to give him the slip, but I have to say my legs do not run as fast as I would like. I think, therefore, that this may be the time to say one or two things to the person responsible for my present condition. You may succeed in silencing me, but that silence comes at a price. You have shown yourself to be as barbaric and ruthless as your most hostile critics have claimed. You have shown yourself to have no respect for life, liberty, or any civilized value. You have shown yourself to be unworthy of your office, to be unworthy of the trust of civilized men and women. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you have done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people."
And it's at this point, with cameras filming the statement outside the hospital, that this news story absolutely explodes. Because not only do we have a former Russian spy dead in London, but he says he's been poisoned by Putin. And then the UK Health Protection Agency reveals that they have found traces of a radioactive substance in him, and they need to start looking for it all around London.
That's right. So the police have got this investigation, which is unprecedented, extraordinary. I mean, the first thing you do is do a post-mortem on the body. That is really challenging because they know there's all this radiation in the body. And one of those involved in it described it as one of the most dangerous post-mortem examinations ever undertaken in the Western world. That's because as they're looking for samples, they know that there is this incredibly toxic, dangerous radioactive substance, which we'll come back to, polonium, which is inside his body. And they know it's in there. And they can see, even though they can't take the normal samples you'd want for a post-mortem, they can take some, and they can see that his organs and inner tissues have been destroyed. I mean, they have been cooked from the inside by this radioactivity. And the determination will be the cause of death was acute radiation syndrome. And it is thanks to this thing called polonium.
Anybody can make this at home.
You cannot make this at home. You need all that stuff like bismuths and reactors and isotopes and stuff in order to do it. So that is going to be an important clue when we get to who was behind this and state responsibility.
But you need to have a nuclear reactor.
You need to have a nuclear reactor
to have polonium. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's basically that's the point. Now, I think it is interesting. It's worth saying that polonium, in some ways, was the best and the worst murder weapon. The best because actually it's pretty hard to detect and hadn't been seen before. The symptoms are so unusual that people don't know what to make of them. And the expectation, I think, in using it is that someone will die quickly and mysteriously so that it's never identified. And the fact that Litvinenko only ingested, remember, he only took a few small sips in the pine bar, and that he was actually in very good physical shape, meant he survived much longer than if he'd had a proper drink of it.
If he'd had a full cup of tea, he would have died within.
He'd have died within a day or two. And even then, remember, it took 3 weeks to solve the medical mystery. He's poisoned on the 1st. They only work out what it is on the day of his death, on the 23rd. So that's 3 weeks to solve it. So any quicker, and they may not have solved it. And if it had happened in a day or two, it would have just gone down as an unexplained death. So I think that's why you can see it's potentially a useful murder weapon. But it's the worst murder weapon because once you do discover what it is, you can follow a trail of where it's been because it's really persistent and you can detect the tiniest speck of it. And because it's so unusual, you can basically look and see where those who've come into contact with it have been.
Which then allows the police to follow a trail that goes from Itsu sushi bar to the Pine Bar to Emirates Stadium, the home of Arsenal Football Club, because Lugovoi had gone to a match there that night.
Yeah.
So I would also imagine that this becomes a massive news story because it's not secret that he's died. It's not secret that he blamed Putin on his deathbed. And now the government, although I guess not the public, maybe not quite yet, but the government knows, the UK government knows, that because polonium was involved, they now have to essentially follow this trail all through London. And that is going to be visible to the public.
Yeah, and you can't keep quiet the fact that there are public health elements because people know there's a mystery to this and that there's radioactivity. So anyone who remembers this from the time will remember it was kind of amazing because I think London, the whole country and large parts of the world watch transfixed as more and more sites around London get closed off by white-suited forensic specialists searching for radioactive particles. And of course, there is this worry for the general public because a lot of people potentially would have come into contact with it. There's a COBRA, which is the name of the emergency meetings government has. And one police officer remembers, as he comes out of it, reporters shouting to him, "Are people safe?" And he's thinking to himself, I don't know. I mean, because no one's ever dealt with this before. I mean, no one's planned for it. And I think in all, there's going to be 40 sites and 750 people who are tested by the Health Protection Authority from 52 different countries, because London's so international, and these are tourist sites, talk about Mayfair and Piccadilly and places like that, and 139 people show some degree of contamination from polonium. And the 4 groups which had the higher levels were Litvinenko's friends and family, office staff from the offices he visited, guests at hotels, and also the hotel and bar staff. And what's interesting is they're able to distinguish between what's called primary contamination, so something directly touched by polonium, and secondary, where it's been transferred, where it's got on someone's clothes and then a speck has fallen off and ended up on a seat or a restaurant or on an airline. And that's crucial. They're also going to be able to use science to look at where and how Litvinenko might have taken it. And if you remember, Marina had kept a clump of his hair, which had fallen out. And they're able to use that and test that to show that there had likely been, and this is important, 2 intakes of polonium. The first one 100 times smaller than the second, and the first one probably in mid-October, and the second one on November the 1st.
Because there was that, well, it was the first attempt, I guess, that Lugovoi and Kovtun made to slip some in his drink.
It looks like he didn't even have a sip, and all you've got is the secondary contamination being enough.
I see.
Because he was sick at that point. So it's so interesting. So using this mix of science and detective work, they're able to look. And of course, the first place they go, or one of the first places, is that Itsu sushi bar in Piccadilly. And that's where he met Scaramella on November the 1st, the day of the poisoning, but before he went to the Pine Bar. And they find contamination there. And this is really interesting, because if you think that Lugovoi and Kovtun are the suspects, then you'd expect to find it at the Pine Bar, but not where he was before the Pine Bar, at the Itsu sushi place. So immediately, in the very first days of the investigation, that makes Scaramella a suspect, because he meets Scaramella on the 1st, and there's contamination there before he goes to see Lugovoi and Kovtun. And it's interesting, Scaramella gets tested, they test the hotel Scaramella stayed at, but there's nothing. And of course, what they then realize is that Litvinenko was also in the same sushi bar on October the 16th when he met Lugovoi, the same sushi bar. So what if it's left over from then? So immediately they're starting to kind of narrow it down a bit.
They also find it at that boardroom where he'd met on the 16th of October. It was on the green tablecloth in between where Lugovoi and Litvinenko had sat when they were having their conversation about the due diligence work. It's primary contamination, so not transferred from somewhere else. There's also secondary contamination of, remember, the shisha pipe that that Lugovoi and Kovtun had used that evening. There's secondary contamination at the bar. One of their hotel rooms is also later contaminated. There's, this makes sense, particularly strong primary contamination in the sink of their room. Looks like they had made an attempt. They had mixed the poison. He had failed to drink it, and then they throw the rest out. And this is down the sink. And then this is that night where they had that night paid for at the hotel and then decided to leave. And I guess it makes sense, because you wouldn't want to continue using a bathroom where you had just dumped out a whole bunch of radioactive poison.
That's right. And so they're starting to build a picture of that first trip. They test the aircraft that Lugovoi and Kovtun flew out on October the 18th at the end of that trip, and they find secondary contamination in the area of the seats on which Kovtun and Lugovoi had sat. They never get the chance to test the incoming flight, because the Russians are playing, once this starts to get public, playing games with what flights they can test and refusing to let some be tested. But then they find it as well, because Lugovoi, of course, made a second trip in late October. And here they find absolutely massive readings in the bathroom of the Sheraton Hotel on Park Lane that Lugovoi had used. And there is so much that the detectives doing the testing, it said, literally run out of the room. I mean, they look at their, you could imagine them kind of looking at their, whatever you use to detect the polonium and going, that is off the scale. And they just bomb it out of the bathroom.
Wow.
And the highest readings for contamination anywhere are found in that hotel room and in the bathroom bin. And they also find contamination in 2 towels which had been through the hotel laundry. So now you're starting to understand the second trip. And the best guess is that Lugovoi spilled the poison in the bathroom.
How does he spill the poison? How does he spill the poison?
I know, but
you would. Was he drunk?
Know.
Maybe he's drunk.
Maybe he's drunk
when he's handling the poison. I feel like if I were in London to murder someone with poison, that I would be very, very careful with the poison.
I think I would be.
I would be like, I'm really going to focus on not spilling this poison when I take it out of my bag.
And instead, you can just imagine in the bathroom, it drops, and then you get some towels to wipe it up, puts it in the bin. I mean, it's like, it's bizarre. So then they're going to find it on Kovtun's Hamburg trip he takes at the end of October. They find it in the car, the passenger seat, even on a teddy bear. And what that looks like is he's shedding little particles of it. So it's not a lot from his earlier attempt. So he's still kind of got it on his system or on his body. And then crucially, they find it for that November the 1st trip. They find it in the room Kovtun stays in at the Millennium Hotel, places Kovtun touched. It looks like they think mixed in the toilet downstairs by reception, which we talked about. The two men went in there. And then it looks like from the readings that it was poured away in the sink in Kovtun's room afterwards, whatever was left over. So it looks like they've been trained to mix it somewhere and then after they've deployed it, pour it away down a sink. And that seems to be a pattern that you see from these various visits.
Now, the pine bar is obviously key. And the detectives are told that the 600 cups and saucers and 100 teapots that the hotel used had gone through 42 washes since the visit, since Litvinenko had been there with Lugovoi and Kovtun. But 3 hours later, the tests come back with what an investigator describes as a nuclear teapot, with readings consistent for polonium poured through the spout. And this, at long last, is the murder weapon. It's the teapot.
Yeah, that's right. They found the nuclear teapot. So they have their suspects. They've got the evidence. The next step is to talk to them.
It is now December of 2006, and officers from London's Metropolitan Police are going to make a formal visit to Moscow to interview witnesses and try to talk, in particular, to Kovtun and Lugovoi.
And the officers are given a security briefing beforehand, warned they'll be under surveillance. I think the spooks give them that briefing, and watch out for honey traps. It's the briefing everyone gets before they get to Moscow. I'm sure you've had that too.
Isn't it surprising, that the Russians even agree to let them come? I mean,
yeah.
What a different world this is 20 years ago.
Yeah, you're right.
That there's even the British investigators go to Russia to even look at this. It's impossible to imagine today.
And we used to take the statements from the Russian authorities almost seriously. The Russian prosecutor would say, well, we've found this or we've done that. And we'd kind of dutifully report it, even with a bit of skepticism, increasing skepticism. But you're right. It does feel like a different age where the police would be allowed to do that. But I think at this point, there is a battle over narratives. I mean, you could imagine if the Russians didn't expect to be exposed for having poisoned him, we'll come back to that, I guess, as the assumption, then they've suddenly got a bit of a problem. And so they're trying to work out, how do we respond to it? Maybe we can deflect. Maybe, we don't want to look too evasive. So they're going to play games with the police on the visit. There's tons of TV cameras and media when they arrive. They meet Russian officials from the Russian prosecutor's office, and it doesn't go well. Officially, of course, the Russians say, we'll do everything we can to help. But they put loads of obstructions in the path of the police. I mean, there are even moments where they're driving to an interview, to a location, and there are cars driving around them erratically. There's attempts to lose them. There's attempts to trail them. There's all kinds of games that are being played. But the priority is seeing Kovtun and Lugovoi in person. And the Brits think they're in a place called Hospital Number 6, which has been built for radiation patients from Chernobyl, which I guess makes sense. The British team are told that these two poor Russians are being treated for radiation sickness. Somehow they've become ill. And so there's delays. There's a 2-hour drive to get to the hospital. Everything is done to delay that initial meeting. And I think looking back, it's partly to get the witnesses ready. Police are told you can't bring in recording devices. Only one person can be present. You have to be quick. And, the claim is that they're radioactive, Kovtun and Lugovoi. So detectives are going to have to wear protective suits. Now, this is where, again, the story almost descends into farce if it wasn't such a tragedy. I mean, Kovtun is dressed in cream-coloured pyjamas and wearing a kind of paper face mask and a blue plastic head covering. I don't quite know what that looks like. But what it means is you can only see his eyes.
Is it him?
Is it even him? I mean, do you know? And at the first interview, they get 13 minutes with him in which he basically denies everything. So it's pretty hard. And whilst they're there, the news breaks back in London that this is being treated as a murder inquiry and not just an unexplained death. I mean, I guess that's obvious, but it does put the pressure on the team and raise the tension with Moscow, because the men are now being treated as potential suspects, not just witnesses. But the crucial thing is seeing Lugovoi. And here the interviews get cancelled at short notice. The claim is Kovtun, meanwhile, has got ill. He's in a coma. I mean, even some of the, this is interesting. I mean, some of the police officers themselves feel sick during the visit. One does, then another one is offered tea the next day with the Russian prosecutor, and he has diarrhea after that. And they do wonder, these police officers, if they've been poisoned. I mean, not to kill them, not polonium, but just to make their life difficult. I mean, I don't know whether you think that's plausible or whether it's just bad water, but you could believe that there's a...
Sure, that would make sense for the Russians to hassle him. I think that would be in pattern. Why make it pleasant for the investigators who are coming over to take a look at these two guys? And they're trying to get Lugovoi for an interview. Interviews get canceled, delayed. They do finally see him, and this is wild. So he's in a hospital gown. He's got a designer t-shirt on underneath and doesn't seem sick at all. His hair's not falling out. Kind of looks like he's just shown up at the hospital in his t-shirt and thrown on a gown over it.
Yeah.
And the investigators do get a longer interview, but are not permitted to record it themselves. The Russians do that, and it's through a translator, and he's less than truthful, I think it's safe to say, throughout this interview.
Yeah, he gets some of the timings wrong of when he was at the Pine Bar. He says he only arrived at 4, but they've got CCTV of him arriving at 3:30, and they're just not getting many details. And, you know, this detail the police remember, at the end of the interview, he just smirks at them, and then in English, everything else has been done in translation. He says, "Good luck with your investigation."
Why are they even admitting that these two guys have radiation sickness?
They're going to claim they are victims.
Of what?
I think they're going to claim that either Litvinenko tried to poison them or someone else tried to poison Litvinenko, and they
just happened to be there.
And they got contaminated.
At the Pine Bar.
Because I guess it helps explain the contamination that's on them and where they've been. If you say, well, we were the victims of someone else poisoning. Okay. So you can, I mean, it's interesting. The police interview Lugovoi's wife. I mean, it's an interesting question because you wonder if she's a bit annoyed at the fact
that he spilled poison everywhere on multiple trips in London and then had the whole family there. And it was Lugovoi's son who he insisted give Litvinenko a hug.
Uncle Sasha shake his hand. Yeah.
Shake his hand.
I mean, a few years later, they do get divorced. So
shocking.
Shocking. Yeah. In all, it's a 2-week trip. I mean, 2 weeks in Moscow in December for the detectives. I mean, I'm not sure it's the most glamorous foreign travel that you get as a detective.
Well, and all the diarrhea they had.
Yeah. I mean, it's memorable, but for the wrong reasons. And then they're made to appear before the Russian media at the end. They get the tapes of the interview because they'd not been allowed to tape the Lugovoi interview themselves. They get back to London, put the tape in the machine, and of course it's blank. There's nothing there. I mean, you're just like, oh, come on.
Now, Lugovoi, in particular, will come up with a lot of great and bizarre counter narratives in media interviews. And the main one is that Boris Berezovsky, killed Litvinenko because the two had fallen out, and Berezovsky had cut off his financial support to Litvinenko.
It's interesting, that one, because that's the one they seem to push. Because, of course, the Russians want to blame Berezovsky for everything. He's the arch plotter. But there is this conversation which Lugovoi recalls that he had in Chinatown on October 17th with Litvinenko, where Lugovoi says that Litvinenko tells him and Kovtun that Litvinenko admits to collecting dirt on people to blackmail them and make money, including Berezovsky. But with Berezovsky, he'd have to do it through a cutout because he doesn't want to, be exposed as the blackmailer. And he says Berezovsky's still paying for his son's tuition. Now, he's obviously got an incentive to try and pin this on Berezovsky and also have a motive for why Berezovsky and Litvinenko might have fallen out. And it is true that the Litvinenko-Berezovsky relationship had been a little bit more fractious. They'd had an argument in the summer, maybe about security advice. The money had been reduced from Berezovsky to Litvinenko, but everyone says they'd actually made up after the argument. They hadn't fallen out. And Marina says the underlying friendship wasn't broken and they were still close. And I think what you're seeing there is the Russians throwing out theories, throwing out different possibilities as much as they can to try and confuse the picture, which is something we see later as a kind of Russian tactic.
And there are also some other giveaways, aren't there? Because after Litvinenko's death, Kovtun has a conversation with, of all people, his ex-wife's mother about the radiation poisoning that he himself is suffering from. And then when interviewed by the German authorities, his ex-wife's mother gives this account of the conversation. He told me that he had probably got some of the poison which killed Litvinenko. He said, word for word, those arseholes have probably poisoned us all. And it's a fascinating little turn of phrase, because who are the arseholes?
The FSB.
It's the FSB, right? And that comment, and frankly, the Lugovoi behavior in the bathroom with like the spilling and the towels and stuff, strongly suggest that these two guys, Lugovoi and Kovtun, probably didn't know what they were dealing with. They probably didn't know it was radioactive. And what they were given by the FSB was probably that they were told it's poison, put it in his drink, but they weren't told what they actually had. And so they themselves are appalled at the risk that the FSB put on them and in Lugovoi's case, I'm sure his family. It's a really interesting insight into how little information even the poisoners had about what they actually had in their vials.
Yeah, I think it is a really telling comment, because it then, you're right, a lot of other things then make sense in the way, wiping it up with towels, Lugovoi introducing his son. All of that makes sense if you think this is a poison that you're given and you're told has to be ingested in food, hence needing the chef, going finding the drinks, all these things, but you not knowing that it's radioactive and leaves a trail, because they don't act in a way that would suggest they knew that, but it would suggest they knew it was a poison, but just not quite how deadly and how persistent it was. So that I agree. I think that comment from Kovtun's ex-wife's mother is actually almost one of the most, the ex-wife's mother. That's the one to be worried about. That's the one that really gives you away. I think it's very telling. But yeah, so by May 2007, the police and the Crown Prosecution Service say there is sufficient evidence to charge Lugovoi with the murder of Litvinenko. At that point, Lugovoi does a press conference denying it all. And he also, at this point, starts talking a lot more about having been approached by MI6. We talked about that earlier as one of the potential motives. And he's going to put that out there. It's interesting because at the time, I think most people thought, again, is this disinformation? Is it true? It could be disinformation, but it also, I think, is quite plausible. There's an element of truth for it. There's a warrant issued for his arrest. Later, there'll be one issued for Kovtun as well. But the problem is Russia says it won't extradite its own citizens.
So what does the UK government do, Gordon? What's the hammer that gets brought down on Moscow for murdering a British citizen with radioactive poison in the middle of London?
Yeah, Thor's hammer is the mighty hammer of the British state is brought down for using radioactive material in London when the UK Foreign Secretary in July 2007 expels 4 diplomats. I mean, I have to say that is... You are right. You are right to be cynical, David.
Gordon,
I'm going to take it.
Don't forget that MI6 cuts off its liaison relationship with the SVR too. So
That's
all
true.
of that, I'm sure, just very juicy human intelligence that SIS was doubtless sharing with the Russians is cut off.
Suddenly stopped.
I'm sure there was very little of substance actually being passed. So that's cut off. And then I guess in return, Russia expels four Brits from the embassy in Moscow. And that's kind of it.
It's crazy, isn't it? Don't you think?
It doesn't feel like a strong response to the murder of one of your own citizens at the heart of your capital.
I mean, maybe the argument is we've let the police do their thing. We've got charges out for these 2 guys, but you still think it's obvious the Russian state is behind this. We'll come back to the evidence, but everyone's worried in this period about Al-Qaeda and terrorists using weapons of mass destruction. We've gone to war with Iraq over WMD. And yet here you've got another state using a weapon of mass destruction, in maybe not mass destruction, but a nuclear weapon in the sense of a nuclear poison against civilians. And the response is, I don't know, it's just feeble, really. I mean, I do think it's shocking, actually. Really shocking.
And do you think it was purposely weak because there's so much Russian money and influence in London in this period that there's a desire to not rock the boat? I mean, I'm not sure there are good options, but there's probably better options than expelling 4 diplomats and cutting off what was already probably a somewhat weak sauce liaison relationship in response. It seems like there is more you could have done. British state chose not to.
I think the British state just didn't want to confront the truth of what had happened. So meanwhile, I mean, Litvinenko himself, a month after he dies, he's buried in a lead-lined coffin. It's such a detail, isn't it? Because of the radioactivity, because they're worried about that still leaking. It's just extraordinary to think that they were still worried about the danger. And he's buried in Highgate Cemetery. I actually went to his grave earlier this year. Highgate. Have you ever been to Highgate Cemetery, David?
I have not. No.
It sounds a strange thing on the tourist trail, but actually of London. But it is extraordinary because there's 2 wings to it. And one wing you've got Karl Marx's grave, and on another you've got Litvinenko, but also these amazing. It's incredibly cinematic, actually, the ruins of some of the graves and these old mausoleums built for rich people in years gone by. But there on one of the paths is the grave for Alexander Litvinenko. So that's the investigation, but the story isn't quite over in trying to bring those behind it to justice.
And so is there any justice for this crime? And who really, I think this is an interesting question, is who really is behind the murder? We know that Lugovoi and Kovtun put the poison in that so-called nuclear teapot, but where did the order come from? How high up into the Russian system did the verdict rise to go and kill Alexander Litvinenko? So many questions still to answer.
That's right. Lots of questions left unanswered. One way of dealing with those questions would be to have an inquiry. But there was no interest from the British government in having that inquiry. And they fought against having an inquiry for years. Now, it's interesting to unpick why. I think, of course, if you're in MI6, you might be a little bit reluctant, mightn't you, to have an inquiry?
Well, as we said, he's probably, I mean, I think Litvinenko is, we could think of him as an agent of sorts for MI6.
Yeah, he was definitely on their payroll. Yeah.
You're right. Yeah, they were paying him as a consultant, agent, whatever you want to call him. I could see why the spooks would be reticent to have an inquiry where a lot of this information could potentially be made public.
Yeah, I think that's right. They were in shock, I think, at first. It was a kick in the guts, one British intelligence officer told me. We never thought they'd do it. I don't think they thought that a British citizen, someone who'd come to the UK, could be murdered in that way. Could argue that might be a bit naive, didn't really understand the history, what the Russians got up to. And, they had potentially been playing a game where they were trying to recruit Lugovoi and use Litvinenko. Maybe Litvinenko was doing a bit off his own back. The problem is that the Russians were playing a different game. They were using Lugovoi to target Litvinenko, but not in the spy sense to target him for recruiting, but to kill him. So you can see the Russians are playing by a different set of rules and a more dangerous set of rules, and willing to play that game on the streets of Britain and go after traitors. And I think it was a sign that the rules were changing, but also potentially that MI6 were playing the wrong game and had been outplayed at it. So I think for that reason, you can see why, can't you? You don't want all the details of your relationship with Litvinenko unearthed at all. But MI6 were at least quite hawkish on the Russians. I mean, they were the ones saying, look, the Russians are a problem. The Foreign Office wasn't even hawkish. They see their role as building up relationships, doing diplomacy, and getting business deals back on the table. And their priority, really at this point, and for a long time afterwards, was getting back to a normal footing with Russia, and all this kind of spy stuff. It's all a bit Cold War, isn't it? We don't want to do this. Just brush it under the table so we can go back to having nice diplomatic meetings. I'm afraid that was definitely the case.
Well, this was an era where I think September of 2011, then British Prime Minister David Cameron visits Moscow. Again, the aim to boost business ties. The following year, 2012, Putin's in London, sitting kind of awkwardly, I would say, beside David Cameron while they watch a judo match at the Olympics.
I mean, isn't that weird to think about
London
now?
Yeah, it is.
Think about
it's remarkable.
Putin coming to London and watching a judo match with the Prime Minister. Different era, but it still points to a political class as well who wanted to build relations with Russia.
Well, in the U.S., we had the reset.
That's right.
In this roughly the same time period. I mean, really in the years after after the Litvinenko poisoning. So it's not only your political class, Gordon.
Yeah.
It's the Americans who are also, I think, now after Ukraine, it's almost impossible to imagine. But there was this time period where you could look at Putin and Russia and the system that he was building, and smart people came to different conclusions about the direction it was headed. There were indications like Litvinenko, I think like the war in Georgia, like a lot of the other murders that we're going to talk about, that there was a very, very dark side to this system and that Putin was playing by different rules. And yet at the same time, you did have this engagement between Russia and the West that was, I think in theory, the argument was that it would draw Russia out of what had been its Cold War stance and bring it closer, at least, to the West. And the Litvinenko murder, stands as a kind of early indication of the real direction the system was going.
You're right. There were policy and political, diplomatic reasons to not want to dig too deep in this and not to have an inquiry. I think there were deeper reasons as well. Russia had built this Londongrad relationship in which Russian money and therefore Russian influence had flooded into London particularly. And I think it's interesting because it never goes into New York, for instance, or Washington or LA or other American cities in the same way. It's London where the Russian money comes, which becomes a playground for their spies. It's also a way in which they can wield influence. London had opened its doors, the Russian money had come in, and that buys you friends, it buys you protection. I remember a year before Litvinenko was killed, so 2005, a British intelligence official, a serving one, confided in me that one of the things that depressed him most from what he saw was the way Russian money had corrupted the professions in London. And by professions, he meant things like law, accountancy, banking. And he didn't mean the kind of things we think about now with corruption, someone taking a bribe to break the law. It was subtler, he said. It was that the amount of money that Russian oligarchs and businesses could offer to lawyers, accountants, bankers, asset managers, estate agents, members of Britain's professional class meant they were willing to turn a blind eye to the origins of the wealth and not ask too many questions. It was quite an insidious form of corruption eating away at public life. And you have this whole class built up in London of people who provide professional services to wealthy foreigners. And that in turn builds a class of people who are dependent, reliant on Russian money.
Yeah.
And it's not corruption in the traditional way. But, that's what's going on in this era, isn't it?
And the mega rich Russians had also figured out how to, I guess, do a kind of reputational laundering through British society. Yeah. So buy a football club, sponsor an art gallery launch, organize charity balls. Even we did, those episodes a while back now on Anna Chapman, and she's the kind of young, glamorous Russian who were kind of swirled around in London society in this time period. And it is almost all the more insidious because it's not very, well, I'm sure some of it was illegal, but a lot of it was not. It was just there was so much Russian money that this whole class of British service professionals got addicted to it and thus had to advance the interests of really corrupt Russians.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not even, you don't always need to advance the interests. You just need to not challenge the interests. And when it comes to a decision, are you going to call for an inquiry or not? Maybe you're not going to. And I think you could see it in, there were politicians and there was a lot of Russian money around politics and socializing. And all of that you can see created this kind of atmosphere. You could see it as a deliberate Russian strategy as well. It's around this time they're using energy supplies to create dependencies in European countries, using lucrative contracts to enrich people and put politicians in Moscow's pocket. So there was a lot of that around Europe, but I think Britain was particularly susceptible to it. And I think the lesson Moscow learned was that Britain wasn't willing to risk its own wealth to stop murders like Litvinenko, to kind of call them out and investigate them.
Well, that all, I think, doesn't justify, but explains why the British state for years did its best to block an inquiry into Litvinenko's death, right? Because there's hundreds of billions of reasons not to look into this.
Yeah.
But what was the actual, obviously you can't say the quiet part out loud. So what was the reason given for not actually conducting the inquiry?
Well, the Home Office particularly said, when it kept refusing a public inquiry, said the revelations might damage national security, including relations with Russia. I mean, it's pretty explicit about that. And this is the thing. It was only the tenacity of Marina Litvinenko that kept the fight going for year after year after year. And I got to know Marina actually very soon after her husband's death. I did one of the first interviews she did, I mean, just days or weeks after he died, in which she talked about it. And one of the things I remember is she was incredibly calm. Anyone who's seen her or met her will know, incredibly measured, incredibly precise. And she is quite extraordinary, because I always think this is someone who ran an amazing, tenacious, determined campaign for justice for years and was not a trained diplomat or intelligence officer or anything else. I mean, no offense to ballroom dance teachers, but that's what she'd been. She wasn't, trained in this world. She'd not come of it. And yet she always knew how to use publicity, how to drive the agenda, how to say something but not go too far, which would alienate politicians in a way which would make them dismiss her. Very measured, very precise, and very determined. And she just keeps pushing for judicial reviews when ministers deny an inquiry. And I went to lots of these legal hearings. Not many other people turned up, but a few of us journalists did. And you could see that she and her friends just kept going. Even when the money started to run out, she just kept going. I think she was mortgaging her house, and she just kept going, fighting for that inquiry.
And then the geopolitical context, the security context, I guess, starts to change, because in early 2014, we have the kind of Russian little green men in Ukraine, the first, I guess, invasion that wasn't quite an invasion. Putin seizes Crimea. Proxy forces move into Ukraine to start fighting. The mood finally shifts. We have senior Russians who are getting sanctioned. I think there's a wake-up call in Western capitals to what Putin and the Russians are actually up to. This is effectively the end of any hopes, I think, of a reset in the States or anything like that. That's done. And finally, that allows, or really maybe forces, the UK government to relent. And in July of 2014, they allow a public inquiry under an independent-minded judge named Sir Robert Owen.
Yeah, and there were public hearings, and I went to lots of them, which are absolutely fascinating. And I have to say, Robert Owen was very impressive as a judge presiding over it. He had that kind of quiet, restrained manner of a British judge, but you could also see him getting angry at times about, because Lugovoi and Kovtun were playing games with the inquiry and, we're going to cooperate, we're not going to cooperate. He was just absolutely dedicated. He was allowed also, there were these public hearings, which I went to, but there were also secret ones, closed hearings, where he got to see some of the intelligence. And his report is eventually released in January 2016. I reread it for this, and it's a really impressive inquiry report. It's just clear, it's direct, it's powerful, it's concise, and it tells the story. And it was interesting, when it came out, I actually sat down with not just Marina, but with Anatoly, Litvinenko's son, to talk about the whole experience at this point, because this was, to some extent, maybe not totally, but the end point 10 years after Alexander Litvinenko had been killed. And Anatoly, he'd been so young when his father had died that he'd had little understanding of what his father had been doing. And he said it was only the inquiry that helped him understand what Litvinenko had been involved in, the things he'd done, what had driven him, the fact he'd still been involved in this world of security and intelligence. I remember him saying to me, I try not to think too much about my early childhood. It's easier that way. But then he also said, my father did a hell of a lot to get me to this country, to make sure I was safe. I need to respect that and do whatever I can to honor his memory. Finding the truth is the closest we can get to justice for my father. And he was a really, really remarkably level-headed, impressive young man, still is, because I've seen him in the last few years as well. And it's a testament, I think, to Marina particularly, but also to Anatoly, for maintaining that, that determination, but also being level-headed about it in a way.
So what does the inquiry say? What were the major findings?
Well, clearly that Lugovoi and Kovtun were the killers, and we should say they have always continued to deny it. The judge also says that the plot to kill Litvinenko may have gone back to 2004, he thinks, so all the way back to when Lugovoi first got in touch with Litvinenko, although he says it's hard to be sure. But the key question that everyone really wanted to know, because I think we knew Kovtun and Lugovoi had done it, allegedly, but was who gave the order. And it ends the report by making clear that in the judge's view, that Lugovoi and Kovtun were acting as part of an FSB, Russian Security Service operation.
Which I don't find surprising. I don't know about you, Gordon.
No.
I think we both believe that this was the Russian state and it was an official operation condoned by the Russian state. But what was the actual evidence presented for that?
Well, some of it probably came from the closed and classified evidence, because you could imagine, couldn't you, that there's probably intelligence from sources in Moscow or Intercept or something else about the FSB, which suggests that was the case. And of course, that can't be revealed publicly, which is one of the challenges. But I'd be surprised if over the years, British and American intelligence allies hadn't collected something in which people are discussing it and saying who gave the order. But that is going to be in the closed report. But I think that's one of the reasons why he's so confident about it. But also, I mean, let's be honest, it is implausible, isn't it, that this was a private hit? Someone who's aggrieved that Litvinenko, for instance, had written a report that he didn't like on due diligence and had decided to kill him. It doesn't make sense, does it?
I think if Litvinenko had been shot, it could be more plausible that it's some kind of private vendetta. Now, maybe it's not the most likely scenario, but then maybe it feels more like a, Russian organized crime, an aggrieved business partner. But the murder weapon, I think the murder weapon is so crucial to understanding who's ultimately responsible, because polonium, you don't scrape it off of the bottom of a pond. You get it from a state level nuclear program. So how do you explain it as anything other than a state orchestrated hit given the weapon?
Because I think even if you were to imagine someone in the FSB hearing Putin going, oh, this guy's really annoying, who will rid me of this turbulent priest, the famous line, and someone thinks I'm going to go do it. Even then, you wouldn't be able to get hold of polonium. I mean, that's going to require a nuclear program, a nuclear reactor, and kind of authorization to get it, to move it. Even within the state, that's not something that's easy. And the only country that's producing polonium from its nuclear reactors is Russia.
Russia.
It's not like the Brits are making tons of it. I mean, tiny amounts of it are sold, and there's weird uses in anti-static guns and things like that. But it's impossible to get hold of it and produce the amounts used in this case without professional state level help. I mean, not least because it's just so dangerous. So I think that is a very clear piece of evidence that it's the Russian state and not either two lone killers or even a kind of rogue operation done off the back by the FSB.
What happens to Kovtun and Lugovoi afterwards? Because I think we left them, but there was some frustration that they had been given a radioactive poison,
Yeah.
without knowing exactly what they had, but they're back in Russia. They seem to, play ball with Russian efforts to stymie the investigation. And where do they end up when this is all said and done?
And that's another bit of evidence, I think, that it's a state activity. Because let's say, allegedly, they were the killers. They deny it. But if it had been a rogue operation or an entirely personal operation, then you wouldn't expect Lugovoi to become an MP and to be awarded a state honour in March 2015. I mean, he's joined Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democratic Party, which is an extremist party, despite the name, a bit different from our Liberal Democrats, but it's quite closely linked to the security services and becomes quite a prominent figure, which also, at various points, gives him immunity from prosecution. So he's becoming significant in politics. And it's not clear what he gets his decorations for, other than in 2015, by that point, relations with the West have soured. So Putin is thinking, I'll stick two fingers up at the West, and give Lugovoi an honour. I mean, that's the only way I think you can explain it. Kovtun, weirdly, doesn't prosper so much. I mean, he kind of disappears.
Well, I guess this leads us to the biggest question, or one of the biggest questions, which is, did Putin himself give the order? Because, and I always find this fascinating with other Russian assassinations, but there's always this question of, is the guy at the top responsible? Did he actually order it? Did he put something down on paper? Did he tell someone that he wanted Litvinenko killed? So I think this question of where did the inquiry come down on the question of Putin's culpability?
Well, the inquiry concludes that Sir Robert Owen says, taking full account of all the evidence and analysis available to me, I find that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, who was the head of the FSB, and also by President Putin, he concludes. He cannot prove it definitively, but he clearly believes it was Putin. I mean, hard to prove definitively because you'd imagine it's a verbal order, rather than a piece of paper. You'd imagine Putin says to Patrushev, get rid of him, and Patrushev puts it in motion. As people said at the inquiry, no one's going to kill Litvinenko in London with radioactive polonium without getting some cover, probably from the top dog. It's a risky thing to do, isn't it? Don't you think?
I think if you're Patrushev or an underling inside the FSB, you're probably not operating with a blanket approval to conduct these kind of operations. The degree to which Putin had any of the details, who knows?
Yeah.
But let's say if you're Patrushev, put yourself in his shoes. You're the head of the FSB. You don't want the boss to be surprised by this and for it to affect relations with the UK in particular, or the EU, or the West more broadly, and for that to be a surprise to Putin. Yeah, you would want to get his approval. And maybe it's kind of vague. Maybe you just say, there's a thing we're going to do, and we're going to take care of this guy. He won't be a problem for you anymore. And Putin says, maybe he doesn't even say anything.
He doesn't
say no. He gives the nod,
head.
Or he just doesn't say no.
Yeah.
It could be very vague. Yeah.
Yeah. But David, what is the British government's response to confirmation from this inquiry?
I'm going to go, is nothing the right answer? Or are there more expulsions of low-level diplomats?
I'm going to say pretty much nothing. I mean, I think there was some vague noises and maybe some vague...
noises. Someone grunted. Grunted at a Russian diplomat afterward.
It's a shocker, David. I mean, Marina had talked about sanctions, expulsion, more action. There's almost nothing. I mean, I guess by that point, we've already started sanctioning people. It's post-2014. But given two opportunities, two different British governments, I should say, of different political parties, failed to take any action that might deter the Russian state from thinking it could murder on the streets of Britain with impunity. I think that is the crucial thing, that both in the immediate aftermath and in this inquiry, there's a feeble response from the British government, which I think encourages Moscow to think, we can do this.
What would you have done?
I think I would have, at the very least, I'd have written a very angry letter.
And you will know how angry we are with you by the time you're done reading this letter.
I would have expelled. I mean, because we'll maybe come back to this, but there were plenty of more people to expel. There were still SVR, FSB, GRU people in London in 2016.
But did they just do the same thing back?
Yeah,
you lose your insight.
But you got to do something. You've got to impose some cost. You could sanction Putin, some of the people around Putin. You could clamp down on some of the dirty money in London. Shock horror.
Yeah, you could do that. That would have been something you could have done.
You could pass some legislation to make it easier. I just think that it was pretty feeble. It was pretty feeble.
You know what they should have done?
What?
Poison the SVR resident in London.
Yeah. Give him diarrhea in the runs. Well, maybe more.
Maybe more. Well, you could do that, right? I mean, are you not allowed to do that? That could be legally challenging.
I don't think we do that kind of thing, David.
See, but that's the kind of thing that would have registered with the Russians.
Yeah.
You do it to one of our citizens, we're going to do it to you. And, it's not like the SVR resident in London means anything to Putin, but, you put one of ours in a body bag and we put one of yours in a body bag. The reason I ask is because I think it actually is a hard policy problem, because the Russians are just, as one of my former colleagues likes to say, the Russian intelligence services, they are barbarians without limits or morals. This is the way he described the Russian security services to be, and it's so different from
the way we play.
Sort of political and intelligence culture in Britain,
right,
or in the US. It's so different.
So if you start playing by their rules, you get sucked into a pretty nasty fight, don't you?
Gordon, there's a question that hangs over this entire series, which we haven't talked about all that much, which I think is like, why poison?
Yeah.
What is the Russian fascination with using poison as a murder weapon of its intelligence services? Because there's a long history of this, isn't there? The Litvinenko case is unfortunately not alone in Russian spy services using poisons to kill their opponents.
And I think that is one of the other pieces of the puzzle which points to Russian state responsibility, is that they've got form on this. There's a track record, and the Russian secret police have been using it for decades. Lenin, after the revolution in 1917, first establishes a poison lab in 1921. And you start to see it used by Lenin, so not just Stalin, who does definitely use it in the 30s and 40s, but Lenin starts using it right from the early days of the revolution. And then you even see in the early Cold War, there's this case, Nikolai Koklov in 1954, who defects, reveals he's an assassin with a gun that fires cyanide pellets, but then he gets poisoned with thallium, 1957 in Frankfurt. Stefan Bandera, Ukrainian nationalist, killed with cyanide dust, some kind of cyanide, 1959 in Munich. So there's a deep history in which they like using poisons. I mean, they like killing people. They like killing exiles. Sometimes it's Trotsky with an ice pick, but a lot of times it's poison. And I mean, I guess there's lots of reasons why poison is useful, isn't it? If you're carrying out what the Russians used to call, I think, wet jobs, killings.
One reason why it's potentially an interesting weapon, I guess we saw that a bit in the case with Litvinenko, is that the time between administering the poison and that the victims seeing the effects mean that the poisoners have time to flee the scene, right? You could escape, right? You can't. It's harder to do that if you're shooting someone. So if you are trying to target someone who's outside of Russia, it can be an effective way to do it. I think there is some value to the Russians in the theatrics of it. There's a theater to the poisoning that draws attention, certainly. And I also think that
fear.
It does. It creates a sense of fear. It also, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it kind of labels the victim as a mark of they're sort of marked by the state as someone who needs to be exterminated in a way that maybe a simple bullet doesn't always accomplish. In this case, the FSB took polonium out of a state-run nuclear reactor and brought it via intermediaries to London to kill someone. So it's a very direct mark, I think, from the Kremlin onto someone they want dead.
It's interesting because it does look like in the second half of the Cold War, the Russian security services, the KGB then, get out to some extent of the poisoning and assassination business. They do much less of it. There's that famous story, which we did, quite a while ago, which was about the poison umbrella, Georgy Markov in London, 1978, which the KGB supplies the ricin, it's thought, for the pellet, but the Bulgarians actually do it because he's a Bulgarian dissident. But the KGB on the whole doesn't seem to do that much in the late Cold War, but they keep the capability. They keep these poison labs. And what's so interesting, I think, is the early 2000s, soon after Putin comes to power, we then see this rise in the number of strange and suspicious incidents, and which look like the use of poison. So in 2002, an Islamist guerrilla leader named Ibn Khattab was killed by a poisoned letter, suspected sent by the FSB. In September 2004, there was an apparent attempt to poison Viktor Yushchenko, the anti-Moscow candidate in the presidential elections then in Ukraine, and he ends up disfigured, by dioxin, his face disfigured, but he's alive. Anna Politkovskaya, the journalist we talked about, is poisoned in 2004, 2 years before she's shot. And I think it gets really interesting because there are some cases in these early 2000s which look like they might have been polonium. So there's a guy called Roman Sepov who'd worked in St. Petersburg in the 1990s with Putin and probably knew his secrets, maybe about links with organized crime, allegedly. And in 2004, he falls ill with symptoms, hair loss, falling white blood cell count, vomiting, reports of radioactivity, all very similar to Litvinenko. And a Chechen guerrilla named Lekha Islamov, also 2004, in prison, refuses to work for the FSB, summoned for a chat, offered tea, and falls ill soon after with hair loss and blisters. Very similar. And this is all in the run-up to Litvinenko. To me, that looks like a renewed campaign to go after enemies with poison. Many of the cases in the early 2000s within Russia, but then increasingly afterwards. And there is a stat that Putin has overseen more poisonings than any other Russian or Soviet leader.
We also talked throughout this series about the many people who are sort of floating around Litvinenko who are going to end up dead. And Boris Berezovsky, one of them, is going to be one of the major targets.
Yeah, that's right. Berezovsky, arch enemy of Putin, does an interview in early 2007 with Luke Harding from The Guardian, where he talks about plotting for regime change in Russia. And you can sense that this is, kind of get the Putin's back up. June 2007, a Chechen comes to the UK, said to be linked to the FSB. He tries to meet Berezovsky, but MI5 and police are following him, so they know about him. And I was told this by a police officer was going to be the single most expensive assassination ever ordered in Britain. Don't know the exact price tag, but I was told in the millions to kill Berezovsky. And this Chechen assassin has brought his son over as cover to make it look like he was a tourist on a trip to London. But the police watching him arrest him before he could do anything. Interestingly enough, he's quietly deported back to Russia. No fuss made. Berezovsky then reveals this story a bit later. Soon after he returned, the assassin is outside a restaurant in central Moscow when two armed men force him into a car, and he's never seen again. But following through the Berezovsky story, Berezovsky's assistant describes in July 2010 two Russians coming over. One gives Berezovsky a T-shirt that he'd been given in Moscow by Lugovoi. And Lugovoi says, give this T-shirt to Berezovsky. And on the T-shirt, it says, on the front, it reads, Polonium 210, CSKA London, Hamburg, to be continued. And the writing on the back says, CSKA Moscow, nuclear death is knocking your door. And CSKA Moscow is the football club that Lugovoi supports. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Is it a joke? I don't know.
The fact that they were making merch around the assassination feels like kind of a grim chapeau detail at the end of this story. Polonium 210, good grief.
Yeah, and then Berezovsky himself gets into this massive court battle in London with his former protege, Roman Abramovich, who, owns Chelsea Football Club and who's been a governor of a Russian province and is close to Putin. Berezovsky says he's owed $5 billion by him. And Berezovsky serves his writ against Abramovich after spotting him out shopping in the London branch of Hermes. But then Abramovich, for this court case, prepares well. He has the best, most expensive lawyers, including Jonathan Sumption, later a justice of the Supreme Court. And Berezovsky loses. The judge, Mrs. Justice Gloucester, says she didn't trust him, even says, there's not evidence of Putin doing certain things. Some of the journalists covering it find this all a little bit odd, but Berezovsky himself certainly does, because he's shocked by it. He thought he was going to win. He's now running out of money. And then in March 2013, so not long after that judgment, Berezovsky's bodyguard, who's a former Israeli Special Forces guy, goes off, leaving Berezovsky alone in his Surrey house. The bodyguard comes back. There's no sign of Berezovsky, but his phone is lying out and there's some missed calls. So the bodyguard goes up to the bathroom. The door's locked from the inside. He kicks it open, and there's Boris Berezovsky lying on the floor with a scarf around his neck, which is bruised, and there's a broken shower rail, and he's dead.
And they test, right? They test it for radioactivity and poison, and I think officially no obvious signs of foul play. I find this interesting. The coroner recorded it as an open verdict, saying that the evidence was contradictory and had left him unable to conclude whether the Russian had taken his own life or had been killed. What do you think, Gordon? I mean, obviously it's a very murky thing. I mean, Putin would have loads of reasons to kill Berezovsky.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. We know Putin had, we think Putin had sent assassins to kill him. He says, allegedly, in case Mr. Putin wishes to sue me or come after me. It's interesting, though, because I remember talking to some of people who were close to Berezovsky afterwards, and talking to one who was completely as anti-Putin as you get. And he said to me, look, I think Boris took his own life because he was so broken by losing that court case. He thought he trusted British justice to give him the answers, and he didn't get them. The money's running out, everything's over. He did it. But equally, I think there are definitely other people who think Putin killed him.
I wander into the minefield of sort of ascribing logic and reason to Russian assassinations with some trepidation. But why he wouldn't also get the theatrical treatment, I don't know. It feels like you would make a point out of it if you were Putin, as opposed to it being this kind of somewhat quiet thing that quite looks like he took his own life. It feels a little incongruous to me. So I tend to come down on the side of he took his own life because he's broken by the verdict of the case, and it's as simple as that.
Yeah. And there's other deaths as well. There's a guy called Alexander Litvinenko, who was a healthy 44-year-old who collapses while running near his Surrey home, November 2012. He was a businessman who'd helped Bell Browder, this very interesting American originally who'd spent time in Russia and who'd then gone on a crusade against corruption in Russia. And Litvinenko was working with him, and he was warned his life is in danger. He drops dead. Surrey police failed to do the proper tests for weeks. Originally say it's natural causes, but then they make more tests. And I remember going to this inquest, I think down in Surrey, and when they make more tests, they find a trace of a chemical in his stomach, which came from a poisonous plant. And it was too late by then to be sure he'd been poisoned. But I went to this inquest, and there was a plant specialist from Kew Gardens. Do you know Kew Gardens, where it's like the kind of world-leading plant experts in this beautiful gardens in West London? It's like something from Agatha Christie, this possibility of a rare plant poison being used against him. But it was hard to be sure. So there were all these deaths. And we talked about others during the series. Nikolai Glushkov, who dies, in London. And it's made to look like suicide. So many. But then I guess 2018... that's the moment Russia does something as extraordinary in many ways as Litvinenko's radioactive poisoning in London, when it uses nerve agent to target former GRU officer Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. But I think that, as they say, may be another story, which we should do another time, because it's worthy in its own right.
That is very much its own series, isn't it? Because it is. In many ways, it rhymes, I think, with the Litvinenko story, doesn't it? Very similar themes throughout, but a very different story. What does Marina? You know her a bit, Gordon. I mean, as we come to the end of this, I'm curious, what does Marina think? Marina Litvinenko, now 20 years on, does she feel that some measure of justice has been served with the inquiry? Is she still fighting on? Where is she in all this these days?
I think the inquiry is very important because it was the moment where the finger was pointed. Because you go back to that deathbed statement from her husband, and it was Putin did this. One thing is to say Kovtun and Lugovoi, that's fine, but it was Putin. And I think finally to have an inquiry say that and say it was Putin, I think that was really important for her. It's interesting though, because she continues to talk and write about this. And part of the problem was that the weak response to the murder and then to the inquiry did effectively fail to deter the Russians. And it's only after Salisbury, and we'll talk about this in detail, that the UK actually finally gets its act together and really takes tough action against Russia. Only then. And then that potentially acts as a deterrent. But I do think the failure to act sufficiently strongly about Litvinenko, it leads us to Salisbury. There is such a direct line. I mean, I saw Marina, when did I see her? I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and we were actually at an event to do with Oleg Gordievsky. And it was interesting because we were talking about Oleg, and people were there from Oleg's family. And Oleg at one point had thought he might have been poisoned, actually. Now, whether he was or wasn't, it's not clear. But he was living under relatively little protection, relatively little security. And it was only after Salisbury in 2018 that suddenly people take this threat seriously, and suddenly there are more cameras and around his house. I think there was a failure there. I think there was a failure really, and that's one of the important lessons of Litvinenko. I think is the need to not sidestep but confront what Russia is willing to do.